All right, so I think that's my cue to start. So, hello, my name is Martin Lim. I'm a member of VAR, and I'm going to be giving the first lecture today on understanding the technical aspects of debate. So, before that, Flores, could we go to the next slide? Yeah, so the first question we generally want to ask ourselves when it comes to debate is like, what is the general goal or what is the thing we seek to accomplish? And that's usually done through two main ways. Next slide, please. So it's generally through winning debates is usually about being able to fulfill the burdens that the rules in debate tell us to do. So typically we're told by teams by the rule books themselves that as prime minister we need to be able to establish the motion, we need to establish the debate and define it, and then as LO we need to set up the clashes already and rebut the points that are made by government speakers. And then at whip we're also told by rules to, of course, not add new material that changes the general direction of the debate. And I think this is one part of it. The second part, of course, is being able to provide persuasive that advance reasons for your side to be supported in that round. So there are two ways with like persuasiveness being defined. And next slide, please. Yeah. So there's usually two ways with how exactly we can be persuasive as speakers. And this is just a very quick discussion on like how to be persuasive. And we need to talk about this for me to move on to other parts of the lecture, which typically will look like talking about definitions, counter props, challenging definitions themselves, and of course talking about what exactly can we look at as an extension and also what we can and cannot do as a whip. So yeah, real quick on persuasiveness then before we move on with the more meatier stuff. Yeah, next slide please. So there's typically two ways with how persuasiveness is analyzed. The first is through analysis and the second is through style. The first thing I'm going to talk about is on analysis. So analysis typically looks like empirical evidence such as the status quo around us, the world that we see, but also we typically are able to see evidence when we touch grass. So for example, we are able to see that in school there are students inside them. That's why it is imperative that schools cater to children or something like that. So that's typically what evidence can look like and how you can use it to be more persuasive as a speaker. And then the second thing is like the mechanisms that you prove that create impacts that you set out in debate. So typically, I think these are links that are typically done to prove an outcome that you typically see and understand through matter loading. And then the next one then is on morals, identifying moral intuitions in favor of an argument. So this could look like arguing for principles in a debate. And then the next is usually through exposing damaging logical implications through rebuttals and counter arguments. And then finally, when you identify emotive responses that encourage us to care more about certain impacts you establish in debate, which is proving relevance, that's usually in the way of weighing that we see. Now, what certain things don't matter to winning debates are typically like the number of arguments you give, of course, how innovative your argument was, and how interesting it is. It doesn't really matter, and it shouldn't matter. And we usually just base it off of these metrics of persuasiveness and how good your analysis is to prove your points. Now, what matters is how important its conclusion seems to be with respect to the burden that each side is trying to prove and the extent that argument is analyzed and responded to. Now, that's when I move on to the next point then. How are you able to exactly convey your analysis towards judges in such a convincing and persuasive way, which is on style. So next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah, so after analysis, there is the second point, which is style, which looks like the way you comprehensively convey your arguments. So it means like comprehensiveness can look like the way you structure your statements can be very, very understandable to judges. And it's very concise in a short way to the point that it's not confusing because you talk about one idea for like 20 seconds. Instead, you can shorten that down to like 10 seconds. And that's usually something that is very effective and a part of your style as a speaker. But also the second is clarity, wherein you can clearly convey the meaning that you want to give to judges and what the points that you're trying to advance in the round. And the third is, of course, the effectiveness of your conveyance, usually through the significance of certain arguments, such as on a moral, practical, or emotional level. And I want to clarify really importantly that, like, just because you say fancy words such as the word delta instead of difference does not meaningfully alter the content of your speech. At the end of like the entire round, it doesn't matter how fancy the words you use. What matters is the ideas that you talk about. So just because like maybe the way an idea and express is better because you use really, really advanced jargon. But if you argue a really dumb idea with cool jargon, you will still eventually lose if your arguments and the content itself is not convincing. Arguments are not persuasive just because they use jargon and stylistic words. Rather, style works to amplify and complement the way your analysis is conveyed to judges. And this makes your points easier to internalize. It makes your and like clarity as a whole and style is something that I think we still care about when we want to get higher speaks. So then with that said, I'm gonna now move on to the more like technical stuff, which is next slide please. So the first thing we're gonna talk about is just like a quick overview on like the roles of different teams and speaker positions. I'm gonna spend like as short of a time on this as I can because I think we're already at a level where we understand each position's roles and like what we need to do. So yeah, next slide please. So typically, we're gonna do the three things, which is I'm just gonna discuss the teams and their burdens and the speaker positions and their said burdens, different types of motions, and then what a POI is. And then yeah, next slide. So in terms of speaker positions, you have opening government, who are supposed to define the motion, set up the debate, advance arguments in favor of their side. Opening opposition typically has to do the exact same thing, maybe redefine the motion to their favor, win on like create rebuttals and establish the clash in the debate and advance arguments for that forwards opposition's points. And then closing government, provide analysis and material in favor of the motion, which is distinct with your from your opening. And it usually looks like new material, new analysis, new responses, new framing, new characterizations. And it's literally the same with closing opposition as well. And then speaker positions, we all know Prime Minister has the role of setting up the debate, defining the motion, setting the clashes, and that's what we're going to talk about later, definitions themselves, the do's and don'ts. Deputy Prime Minister responds to leader of opposition. Their typical goal is to win on clashes themselves and order to like establish a win for opening government and the win for their side. And then opening opposition, on the other hand, you have LO who must establish the clashes within the debate, and DLO needs to win on said clashes by adding new material, reiterating some material that was said from your first speaker in a more convincing manner, in a more like strategic manner. But like the next then is on member of government, which is extending the debate, which I'll get onto later as well. Like what exactly can we define as a new and novel idea? But also GovWhip, who has the role of not adding new ideas and material into the debate to define the metrics. Rather, their goal is to rather define the metrics of the way the debate should be judged. And then the same applies for literally closing opposition, where you have member and opwhip as well. So now we're gonna go to the really significant point for Prime Minister that I think is a bit more technical, which is on definitions. Next slide, please. So yeah, I think that definitions themselves can seem very simple. However, I think a lot of debates that typically end up becoming really low in terms of like the level and quality of the round typically are a result of a first speaker or two first speakers who typically mess up the definition of the debate, create the clash on something that is incredibly like it shouldn't be a problem in the first place to define what something is, yet it still becomes one because speakers really confuse what exactly a definition should be, but also they confuse how exactly we challenge definitions. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is why I think this is probably a really meaty part of the lecture. So, what is a definition? I think it should be at a level of generality when you define an idea and the motion itself. You're explaining what something means in the motion, and how you explain it and the reasons for explaining it should be very general and as like considerable to the majority of cases where the motion applies. So it is legitimate to exclude the most extreme and marginal cases when you establish a definition. For example, this house would ban cosmetic surgery. So I think as PM, you can argue that you ban cosmetic surgery except for burn victims. This is a valid definition to make because burn victims make up a very marginal percentage of people who opt into cosmetic surgery. So you can argue that you can argue that it doesn't exactly apply. The debate doesn't apply to these people because they're so few in number. Now, another way that in comparison, a very bad definition of that debate or that motion looks like this. So me as prime minister, I'm walking in and I'm saying we're gonna ban cosmetic surgery only for children. Now, this is not a valid way of defining the motion because again, you're like limiting the debate to such a small audience that is not very generous to any side of the debate. Maybe it's strategic for yours if you wanted to, but it like literally does not take up a considerable majority of cases where cosmetic surgery applies. Now, I think this is where like we should remember that definitions aim to include the considerable majority of cases because you as a prime minister don't just have a goal of winning the debate, but you want to establish that the debate happens in the first place. Now, I want to establish something that's also important. Teams still have to provide clear criteria on which cases are excluded, and there needs to be a compelling justification for doing so. Exclusions shouldn't exactly disadvantage any team in the debate. So, legitimate restrictions may look like limiting the debate to cases where the motion would most plausibly be implemented. So, an example of this, for example, this house would ban religious courts like Sharia law. This would probably exist in states where the community is overly religious, and saying that is probably a legitimate justification because it's about religious courts and you can characterize it as something that is integral to religious people. It's something that would likely exist in places where religion is very popular, and these typically look like these religious states. So you always still have to give justification for why your case should be limited to a certain group of people. I think there's a difference between like an unfair definition and a strategic definition. Now, I think this is the next like important thing I want to talk about definitions, about the difference between what is fair and what is strategic.
Hi. So sorry. I believe Marty froze, but luckily he's just in the classroom next door, so I'll try to get him and go on this laptop instead. You wanna? Let's get mine.
Thank you. Sorry, I ran out of Wi-Fi for some reason. Okay, resuming then on where was I? Okay, now there is a significant difference between an unfair definition and a strategic definition. Both aim to disadvantage your opponent by forcing them to engage on a portrayal of the characterization, by portraying their best case as still having bad consequences and implications. Now, unfair definitions, on the other hand, are different. These unfair definitions are typically either they are unproven, they are like, and the average reasonable voter would find the justification for said unfair definition to be just completely false, but also they prevent any form of debate from happening. So and then lastly, they're just uncharitable. an example of this is, for example, like when you're talking about a debate based on space travel, and then your opposition argues that the moon is made of cheese. This is like, to an average reasonable voter, you yourself understand that that is incredibly false. So that is, we can consider that a definition that is just not true. Now, the consequences of running an unfair definition is typically that, like, judges will typically not like this. They will spot it out, and they will typically minus your own speaks. So, but also if opposition is good and you still want to argue this unfair definition, they will definitely still have an easier time beating you out and proving you as a unfair actor in the debate, completely boxed out, whatever. And I think it's just like better to just find and understand the difference between what is unfair and what is strategic. And now that's what I'm gonna do. So what is a strategic definition? Literally, you just have to prove why exactly you're disadvantaging. Like, you just have to prove why the disadvantage you're placing on your opponents is justified. So you can typically argue that, for example, in this case, in the religious courts motion that I talked about earlier. So I can say that it would only apply to a very conservative group of people who are very centric on religion. This is considered fair because I am proving that, like, oh, typically religious courts rise up when there is a majority populace who really enjoys or is really central to religion itself. They value religion to such a high extent, they want to integrate it to their daily lives to the point where they're willing to allow it to affect their own moral decisions and principles. So this is a prime example of something that, like, me proving that my definition that is somewhat exclusionary is justified and fair. Now that is what exactly strategic definitions are. You just really have to like structurally explain why the advantage that you're putting your team in is something that is good but also reasonable. But also, I think that definitions are still like the strategicness of your definition is contingent on how persuasive you prove said definitions. So it's also important to show even ifs to express charitability and preempt the attacks on your definition. So when you're trying to prove a definition, it's still good to establish arguments that are very even if. So for example, if government runs an unfair definition, you as opposition are going to redefine the debate. You prove reasons why your definition is far more strategic but also likely and fair. It's still good to run the even if arguments just to show that you're being a charitable opponent to your to government. And okay, so what if your opposition against a very good prime minister who is themselves running a very strategic definition? I think that is when you challenge the well-protected definitions. The You need to challenge them in ways that, like through well-built rebuttals and weighing analysis to be more persuasive to prove that the said definition is unfair, or whether or not it's fair or not, you have to just prove it yourself that the definition is unlikely or untrue. So strategically, you can also build your arguments on their definition themselves, and that is usually how you do your even ifs. Now, so what if your prime minister or like the person who established the debate does a very bad job of it? That's when definitional challenges are come into play. Can we go to the next slide? I think that's when I talk about it. Oh, fiat. I'll skip that first. I'll go for it later. Sorry, I misplaced that. So, uh, wait. What? Okay, skip again. Okay, next. Sorry. Okay, bad definitions. So definitions are valid, or definitional challenges are valid when two things happen. The first is when a team squirrels the motion definition, which is typically, like, based on my understanding, it just means failing to fulfill the burden set to them. So it typically means that a definition has been diminished to the point that teams have to prove it, but they just refuse to. So a definition is a squirrel if it is inconsistent with the words of the motion. An example of this is like, this house would ban guns, and the prime minister sets up the word gun to be defined as assault rifle. So it only applies to the word rifle. We're only banning these high caliber weapons and stuff. This is clearly an invalid example of what a gun is. I think that it is uncharitable as a whole, and that is an example of OG squirreling their definition. It means that they are just fulfilling to be, they're failing to be charitable. They're failing to actually accept the considerable majority of cases, and they are limiting the debate to such an unfair extent. And that's when you can come in, challenge the debate, and say that they are failing the burden. And um, but another reason a definition can be considered a squirrel or failing to fulfill burdens is when it is literally creating a debate that is undebatable in the first place. An example is that this house gets religion-funded welfare services. OG cannot just define the debate as only encompassing the negative instances of religious institutions, like making the debate only about the poorly run orphanages and the poorly regulated orphanages and abusive schools. This unfairly limits the scope of the debate to the point that it literally deters debates from happening in the first place, because it's very obvious that you as opposition would not want to defend something that is incredibly morally bad, but OG is forcing you to do it. And that is an example of them unfairly limiting the debate to the point that it literally creates no debate in the first place, and you as the opening opposition have that goal, or like should have that prerogative to want to challenge it. Now, the second reason why a definition could be bad is if it's incredibly vague, which means typically, like, either one, they are failing to specify what groups of people the policy applies to. But also, secondly, the circumstances where it will be implemented are not talked about at all. And thirdly, the agent who will implement the policy or the agent who will implement the idea is not talked about. And lastly, the consequences for those who resist or deny it are never talked about or discussed as well. I think a vague definition isn't an invalid definition. It just undermines the persuasiveness of a team that wishes to like win the debate and advance arguments. The proper response is to identify the vagueness as its impact and its impact to the debate. Like, in order for judges to merit this definition as something that is false and vague or incredibly failing to fulfill burdens, you have to be able to call it out in the first place. If nobody calls out a bad definition, judges are made to believe that this is the norm of the debate, and the debate will continue in a normal manner with said bad definitions. So it is incredibly important that you guys will be able to spot out what a bad definition is and be able to redefine the debate to a way that is more like fair and less disadvantaging for your side. Now, opposition teams may choose to provide reasonable consequences or interpretations based on this vague definition, but they cannot ignore that it does that. They cannot ignore its existence. They cannot replace it, nor can they claim that OG have to defend very unreasonable applications of the policy. Judges are not allowed to credit advantages because a previously vague policy gets clarified or refined in a way that disables their opponents to respond. So, for example, if your prime minister, if opposition argues a very uncharitable and vague definition of the motion, and you as deputy are able to sufficiently respond to said definitions and advance arguments that prove how the consequences are very bad if we accept that definition, and that is how the debate progresses, and then suddenly deputy leader of opposition comes into the debate, completely redefines, or like not necessarily redefine, but is able to shift the idea of the definition to a more reasonable way, and then be able to prove how all the arguments are still going to win the debate for them. This is something that really shouldn't be merited, because like there's no capacity for teams to respond to this, especially OG, because it's such a backloaded case. And but also it assumes that the whole persuasiveness of the case is only won through that clarification or redefinition that comes out from DLO. So judges shouldn't be able to merit that, but if they do, it's probably a judge issue. Now, it's also your guys' job to POI it in case it's too unfair. And you have to be very careful of those really backloaded cases. And there's really no other point to like, there's really no other way to engage with it other than just throwing POIs. And so judges should typically be able to understand that that is a backloaded case and not credit it. But if they do, it's really just a judge issue. Now, let's go on to the next then. Challenging the definition. Can I go to the next slide real quick? Okay, Challenging definitions. So this must be done during the leader of opposition's speech. If you don't try to challenge the definition by calling out its flaws, the debate will proceed under these unfair definitions. Definitions that are illegitimate must be proven they're illegitimate. You cannot just say it's a bad definition of the motion without explaining what a bad motion definition looks like and explaining its connection to it. So you cannot just call out OG by saying this is an unfair debate or it's a vague definition of what that is. You have to be able to provide structural reasons to prove why it's bad, to prove why it's uncharitable, to prove why it's marginal in the vast majority of cases. So LO can challenge and redefine the motion and should tell debaters and judges what the proper definition is on OG and then argue against said definition. So if OG argues a wrong definition, LO must redefine that definition, prove it, and then rebut OG based on your own definition, and then provide even if arguments, assuming that the judges don't buy your redefinition of the motion. Note again, it is, sorry. Now, debates that revolve around unnecessary definitional debates over reasonable definitions typically hurt your personal speaks. So if you guys are just going to keep arguing about whether or not the sky is blue or grass is green, if it's such a petty argument and definition debate, you typically will get lower speaks because you're typically wasting time on unpersuasive arguments instead of talking about more relevant arguments in the round that you can advance. So I think teams really have to be careful about spending and investing too much time on a very bad opening government or opening opposition, because that typically means that you end up falling under the quality of the round. So you are a great debater and your opening opposition or opening government argues a very bad definition. And what teams typically fall for is by lowering themselves to that level and trying to fight OG on a very bad definition. And the whole debate and the whole opening clash becomes just about those few little definitions that you guys are arguing about, which is why it's incredibly important to flag out why you're valid in giving a redefinition of the debate, but also why it's incredibly important to provide even if arguments, assuming that judges will not buy your redefinition. Now, that's when I'm going to now move on to the next point, which is about counter propositions. Counter propositions are not an automatic burden placed on opposition teams. It is a tool in a toolbox. You do not have to do this every round. You do not have to do this every policy motion. And it should only be done on debates that allow for policy motions to exist. So you cannot really argue this in motions that are very, very vague or very, very principle and moral centric. These typically become very relevant only in like this House would motions or policy motions as a whole. Now, the same way how PM can set up a model for government, it's only valid for LO to be only the one who can set up the counter proposition. Counter propositions have the same level of fiat that that government teams usually get in policy motions. And fiat typically means like assuming governments have the capacity to implement the policy and it will be passed in Congress. But fiat does not extend to how people will react to the policy or whether or not people will comply. So again, I want to reiterate, debates that talk about fiat should not fall under the implementation process. It should fall on the impacts of the policy's implementation. So we have to assume that the policy will pass in Congress and it will be done by governments. They have the capacity to be able to advance it in court. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they will do it well. It doesn't necessarily mean that people will comply. It doesn't necessarily mean that governments have good incentives. It doesn't also necessarily mean that governments will be able to have the resources to do it properly. It just means that in court, we're going to say yes to it. That is the extent of fiat. And this is very important for like other discussions that I'm going to talk about, especially when I get to motion burdens. Now, counter props, the difference between counter props is that they must be mutually exclusive with the model presented by Prime Minister. Note that counter props must alter the comparative of the debate the same way how all teams must compare the policy proposed by government. The debate is then judged normally with benefits and harms of both proposed models. So it's typically just like when it's a policy debate and government talks about a policy that should be advanced, opposition has the fiat power to argue a policy that is completely exclusive from what government can argue, and it gets the same fiat that you would see in a gov policy debate, and like the debate just talks about comparing the two policies. Now, an example I will give is like this house would increase taxing of individuals in the highest income bracket. And opposition can can establish a counter proposition that no more taxes becomes the norm. So instead of taxing the rich, we literally just oppose taxes. And like no more taxes, abolishing it is the policy that OO wants to advance. If OO then talks like this is a valid counter proposition because abolishing is a completely different mechanism to increasing taxes. Now, if opening opposition wants to forward a counter proposition of educating the rich on philanthropy and incentivizing them to do so, this is not a counter proposition because governments can still do this in their paradigm. And now, there is a difference. I think this is very important when you want to question what a counter proposition is. There's a big difference between what a counter proposition is and an alternative is. So an alternative is typically something that we can view as viable, like it's another option that people can opt into, another way of proving an impact, another argument as a whole that people just like can reach the same impacts that governments or like opposition teams want to go for. So I'm gonna give an example between a counter proposition and an alternative. This house would invade Iraq to replace the heads of state. Opening opposition cannot counter-propose funding rebel groups because that isn't exactly strictly mutually exclusive. When you want to replace the head of states, governments can still fund said rebel groups. And this is an alternative, though, if opposition wants to argue this. If the motion was then about this house as the US would invade Iraq with military force, opening opposition saying we would rather fund rebel groups and opposition parties is then a valid counter proposition because military force is not the same as funding opposition and rebel groups. Alternatives are viable arguments and solutions that aren't the same as advanced by proposition's model. Opening opposition can point out superior alternatives without committing to a counter proposition. So, like, I think the question then is like, why then is like a alternative a viable option that opposition teams would want to advance? So it usually means providing a range of possible alternatives isn't the same as providing a specific mechanism opposition bench must abide to. So that is why they're completely different from counter propositions. Opposition doesn't have fiat for alternatives, and governments may question feasibility of the alternative opposition is forwarding. And then lastly, alternatives may affect OG's persuasiveness, whereas counterprops alter the comparative in general. Now, alternatives still have to be proven, though, to be superior in order to be a winning argument. Now, that's it for counter propositions. Can we go to the next slide? So, yeah, I talked about those. Okay, member. So the biggest problem I think member speeches usually fall under is they typically become either novel, as in this is the typical goal we member speakers have, but like the biggest like problem that we fall under is that we end up becoming too derivative of opening. So we can talk about what exactly is considered effective novelty and what is considered derivative, and I think this is a big problem that most members usually fall under when forwarding a case. And then the next point is like, when is knifing considered an option that we can use at member? So next slide, please. So what do we consider an extension? So next slide, by the way. Yeah, sorry. Okay. So can we please go back real quick? Sorry, Clarice. So what is considered an extension? It is literally anything that has not been said in the round. So this typically looks like new arguments, new rebuttals, or new material that responds to opposition speakers, and new criteria and ways of judging the debate. Closing teams can be credited for contributions that go beyond what has already been said and contributed in opening half, but they don't just win through minimal additions to already well substantiated points. It is about extents of their contribution that is more meaningful to what has come before. So if certain arguments have been won by material, have been won by from opening already, closing can add new analysis to these arguments that allow them to beat opposing teams, but it's unlikely that they have good grounds to win over the opening, and thus it is advisable to provide new ways of bank or new arguments and material to bank your speech and your case under in order to win on your opening as well on exclusive grounds, so that it can be compared to, so that it cannot exactly be compared as derivative of your own opening. And I think this is especially relevant in other circuits wherein they really view having the same level of mechanisms or similar levels of impacts as incredibly derivative and immediately just make you lose over your opening. So sure, you are able to add new analysis and new arguments to so like when you run that vertical extension, the new analysis and new arguments you give beat out your opposition teams, but it's very, very vague or like unclear how how that is exactly a good standard for beating your own opening. So just because you say at your weighing that, oh, it is because of our analysis that makes us win the debate and beat out opposition teams, that doesn't exactly become a valid standard of proving why you beat your own opening apparently anymore. Now, next point, knifing. Next slide, please. Okay, so when is knifing okay? So knifing is typically considered as a valid point that teams go through. They are, however, very, very rare. It is very rare where knifing is viewed as good because it requires three things. The first is that your opening team concedes the debate and have made incredibly crippling concessions that make it impossible for your bench to win. The second is then like OGs or opening teams squirreling the definition and failing to just fulfill burdens because they want to talk about a very marginal group of actors that the debate falls under. Then the third thing is when opening teams create incredibly blatant false statements that just like would not be bought by anybody in the round. And for example, it's like claiming Joe Biden is the leader of Russia. This is very clearly false. And if the debate starts revolving around this, I think closing teams have the opportunity and the validity to knife opening. Now, closing teams still have to be consistent with other things opening says. This isn't a blank check to just argue your own stance in the round. And these cases are also incredibly rare in the first place. Now, proposing a different metric by which the debate should be judged and evaluated is not exactly considered knifing. So if you want to talk about different ways, like how when you're weighing against your opening, you can talk about how an impact that you at closing emphasize and prove is more important than what the impact opening proves. That is not considered knifing. Now let's go on to the last speaker, which is about whip. Yeah. So good whips note major clashes in the debate between both sides and will make use of existing arguments from each side, preferably their own though, to win the clashes themselves and prove how the arguments that their own member has extended on are a lot more important and relevant to the round. Now let's go on to the next point, next slide, which is about what exactly whips should not do. Whips should absolutely not add new material to the debate. Now, what do we consider as new material? New material can look like material that completely shifts the direction of the case, which is like you at whip are completely arguing a different important impact that your member talks about that is completely unacceptable of a new argument. And but also I think it's also giving entirely new reasons and new incentives to do things to the round. So for example, you're gonna talk about it's an actor motion, and at whip you talk about actor incentives, and it's completely different from what the round has discussed. That is then considered something that is new material and is not credited. And the third thing is that like claims of new impacts that will occur. Now, it's okay to argue a new extent of impacts can happen, but you have to tie it back with logic that you get from your member. If you're suddenly going to argue new impacts will occur without exactly proving things and how it was related to anything that the speaker said in the round, for example, you prove that new terrible impacts will happen because of what opposition said at closing, and then you argue how new good impacts will happen based on your member. If a whip starts arguing completely new impacts that were not discussed at all from both sides, but also are independent of the mechanisms that were talked about, that is considered new material. Now, what doesn't count as new material? Next slide, please. What we don't consider as new material are typically new defenses of arguments that have already been made in the debate. So if you want to continue to rebuild and establish new ideas and arguments that prove that your case and extension is actually very well-rounded and persuasive enough, that is considered a new defense, and that is not new material that shifts the general direction of your whole extension. New explanations of previously made arguments is also not a completely new idea you're positing in the round. You are just like showing the extent of the extension. You're showing how exactly it can range from different ideas and affect different spheres of influence, different spheres of impacts as well. Now, then there's also the new rebuttals that you can give, which is of course not new material that shifts directions of cases, but also new examples and new explanations. And I think the fifth point is when weighing comes in, where you explain ideas as to why something is worth prioritizing more than the other. And so to summarize, if the other side has little ability to engage with this point that you are advancing at whip, then it's probably new material because of how the claim may raise new issues or may raise new approaches to winning the debate entirely. Whips that add new material usually just get ignored by judges, and if they get credited, it's a judge problem. And then next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna do a bit of do I have time for an exercise? Okay, yeah, I don't have time for an exercise. So just Q&A na. Yeah, okay. So
Hello. Sorry. Okay. Oh, the blur does not work on two people at the same time. Okay. Do you want to connect from your device or do you want to stay here?
let's stay here now.
Okay, sige. So there are two ways you guys can ask questions. The first is that you can just raise your hand. Yeah, through Zoom. Or the second thing is that if you're too shy, don't worry, Morty's not here. He stepped to the side. I can look at the questions and I'll be the one to say it to him. So I think safe to say let's just give it until 7. So any questions that are going to be asked, please ask them before 7. If there's no questions or there's at least like not a list of questions that need to be answered, then we'll just proceed with the next lecture at 7. I guess you can also take this as a time to rest or take a break if you need it. I guess we'll just stay here. So,
Okay.
no, Morty, don't look at the name.
Oh,
It's anonymous. Okay. As government whip, does flipping a mechanism that come from LO count as new material? So you're
No.
government whip and you're flipping material from
No. It's like so to answer that, I think like flipping material is typically a way of adding like new rebuttals to the round. And it's not exactly creating an entirely new impact from invisible mechanisms that never were talked about in the round. So I think as whips, we generally want to make use of materials said from speakers in the round already. And then being able to just like, as long as you flag out that the mechanism that you are flipping is from LO and was talked about extensively in the round, then that's not new material as well. Yeah. Hope that answers it.
Okay, second question. Oh, there's a lot. Okay. In terms of framing a debate, what should be the primary looked at question before anything else, like priorities? I will say, next session 2, yes, so the one on Friday, it is about framing. we have a lecture rather specifically on framing, so you might get a more structural and technical answer then. But at least right now, I think Marty can answer it preliminarily.
Okay, I need to read it.
What should be the priority in terms of framing a debate?
Primary, I think the first question we just ask when we try to frame a debate is just like, what is the most common application of this idea in the status quo? So, for example, this house would ban guns. When we want to frame what a gun is, we just like first we define what is a gun. Is it a rifle? Is it a pistol? It is both. It is a firearm. It is a device that shoots bullets. And then you then ask questions such as like, um, what you then ask the next question is like, how do people feel about guns? So I think the first, to summarize it, the primary looked at question that people ask when they want to frame something is, what does this look like? What do people feel about this? And why is it important? So those three questions.
Next question. For closing houses, what's the most strategic way to clean up after messy definitions and framing from both opening houses?
Oh, okay, yeah. So for closing houses, if both your opening teams are like run completely terrible definitions, it is valid for member to come into the debate and redefine it as well. So I know I said earlier that LO's only leader of opposition can advance counter propositions. But if you're a member as well, if you as LO are also like not able to advance valid redefinitions of the debate, closing teams can come in and just argue the more realistic world. And I think that's a part of reframing the debate. So I think this was also talked about in my lecture and what I said earlier as to what exactly we can consider as new material. And that can be new analysis that proves certain definitions are untrue, certain definitions are more relevant. And it's also just like proving that in terms of application, this impact is a lot more extensive and also more relevant to certain groups of people that you talk about at closing. So if you can do this at member though, you cannot do it at whip. You can only redefine motions at closing when you're a member and not whip. Yeah.
I will say also that we actually our third lecture for today. So the second lecture is on argument and case construction. The third lecture is on free strategy and BP. So I guess if you want Bea's thoughts on it, feel free to throw back that question when it's Bea's talk. That's the third lecture. How do you think of an issue, and then how do you align your arguments to the issue? I think this is like quick.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So issues are typically just the way I like to look at issues is through clashes. So I will find clashes that exist in the round, whether or not for example, um this house opposes the creation of religious courts. The typical clash that I expect to see is about courts are oppressive, and then another side will argue for religious courts that courts are more fulfilling for religion. So you have two sides arguing that religion itself is oppressive, religion is fulfillment. And that is an issue on its own. You see a clash, and then the question you then ask yourself to define the issue, oh, by the way, you're low bat. So when you're asking yourself what is the issue here? You're trying to find what the question teams are answering. Fulfillment versus oppression. Like people are harmed versus people are fulfilled. I think the issue becomes like a question of how do people feel about religion? Do they find fulfillment in it or do they feel more oppressed by it? That is when I center my issue around it. Like whether or not I want to talk. So when I'm a whip speaker, first issue, I want to talk about how religious courts, whether or not they fulfill people's goals with religion or they continue to oppress them. So the way I can restructure that is by saying, what do these religious courts look like and how do they interact with the average individual? That in it of itself is an issue. So to summarize, if you want to align it with your arguments, you need to be able to talk about different key points from your extension and be able to use said extension and use it to prove why you win on a certain issue. That's typically how you do it. You always want to refer back to your member when you want to win on an issue because the logic that they use should be the reason why you win. and not exactly the issue, not exactly the points and material that come out from whip, because whip cannot advance new material that changes the round direction. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. If you have a follow up, go ahead.
Hi, sorry. I will just transport this really quick because I'm low back. While that I'll read the next question. As closing. Wait. As closing. Wait, there are a lot of questions actually. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm actually just going to filter through them because I feel like other questions can be answered by other lecturers, at least today. So let me just scroll through them. If I miss your question, it's only because I think that we're a bit short on time, and I think Bea or Alyssa would answer these very, very well as well. Hmm. Okay, I think this one. As a deputy, how do you save your first speaker on opening if they aren't able to do their frame slash burden well? Especially you also don't have a set of arguments and responses that you need to prioritize. This question.
Okay. Okay. So first, I think in terms of uh, if your first speaker makes mistakes, I think that is like it's already a problem in itself. Like you guys are already going to be at a very risky situation in the debate, especially if you are deputy leader of opposition, and a lot of the good and winning material comes out from you. And the way you save your first speaker is by gaslighting judges and debaters to believe that the things that you are saying came out from your first speaker. That typically looks like talking about how the underlying logic that your first speaker was trying to imply and argue are things that you are just reiterating and proving. So you can argue that the mechanism about this definition came out from my first speaker already. I am just going to prove how that mechanism engages with the rebuttals and claims of opposition. So like honestly, I think that definitions and framing are incredibly important at opening. So if you have other sets of arguments and responses that you want to prioritize, if your issue from your team is your framing and you need to clarify it, it is probably the most prioritizing thing in the debate to do in your speech. You have to be able to establish a good definition and a strategic one if you want to be able to win at opening. And if you're not able to do this, then you probably will lose. And that is why you need to prioritize it at number one right away to reframe, re-clarify, and defend your first speaker's points, especially the rebuttals and scrutiny against them is on their frame.
Okay. So for context, there are a couple of people who asked about kind of like how closing works. Again, I think Bea can answer this really, really well, especially since her talk is about the strategy in BP. Bea, you should talk about that in your lecture. Okay. And then but I think generally, I think a lot of the questions about closing are just kind of like how are closing extensions um evaluated, and what's like what did you say are like the different strategic benefits and harms to a horizontal or vertical extension?
Okay, okay, actually, wow, so it's a judge question perspective. Yeah, I can do this. So one thing to note, the value of a horizontal and vertical extension kind of depends on the circuit as well. But I'm gonna still talk about like the difference. But like basically, in some circuits like Europe, they really hate vertical extensions with a passion. So it wouldn't be advisable to even think of running a vertical extension, depending on the circuit you're in, unless it is very obvious that your opening is really bad. So okay, let's talk about then our circuit, or the more like normal way of thinking about horizontal versus vertical. So the way a vertical extension is evaluated is typically through like whether or not the mechanism and impacts are the same. So if you are running the same mechanism that you hear from opening, you cannot just reword things. You cannot just say the mechanism better. Smart judges will be able to spot this out and literally just say, oh, but their mechanism is literally the same. as opening. So you really need to be able to think of a way to change up your mechanism as a whole. And that's usually what takes you to the horizontal extension side. But if you do want to really run the vertical extension and accept that your mechanism is the same, this is when you start talking about impacts and extent. I think that's when you talk about proving certain ways that you engage. So very basic. You need to, of course, if you're gonna run the vertical extension, you need to win that. You need to make that extension the winner in the round. So you need to be able to run it, prove how that analysis that you are adding beats out everything opposition says, and then you need to prove how additional analysis that you are proving is integral to being able to achieve the impacts that OG wants, or your or OO, or whoever is, or whatever bench you're in. So to summarize, vertical extensions are won when they win out on opposition bench or your government bench or opposing teams as a whole. That analysis that you add wins the clashes. The second is the analysis that you add is then able to better provide certainty to the impacts that your opening wants to give. Three, better prove that there are a lot more impacts that you're able to receive. And four, be able to prove that like the other impacts that you are trying to win on are a lot more likely only through your closing speech and your extension. So it's very, very difficult to win on vertical extensions nowadays because it's so reliant on the similar mechanisms that are and like impacts that are implied from opening. But it is still possible to run vertical extensions. It's just very difficult to do, especially in higher rooms. Horizontal extensions, on the other hand, are a complete shift of the mechanism that you are running. And usually, the way you win and prove that horizontal extensions are better is literally just through weighing and like it's through weighing and proving relevancy as to why an impact that your mechanism proves that is not proven from opening is far more important, how it is far more likely, and in terms of scale, far more like big in terms of size and magnitude. And those are typically like why horizontal extensions are the recommended way to run closing speeches. Because in higher rooms, it's really difficult when your opening is good enough to be able to establish impacts already, is able to imply impacts as well. So hopefully that answers the majority of questions.
Hi. So to anyone who have asked questions and we didn't really directly respond to it, sorry, but we're a bit short on time. But again, I had specifically filtered that in the way that you can ask Alyssa or Bea about it. Because Alyssa talks about arguments and case construction and Bea talks about the strategy and BP format. So everyone say thank you to Morty. Give a heart react to Morty for his amazing lecture.
Thank you guys for my first lecture.
First lecture. All right. So next we have also well decorated speaker. Clarice, are the slides ready?
Wait.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so the next lecture, I guess I'll just introduce it. So the next lecture is about argument and case construction. If you haven't noticed it yet, a lot of the lectures we're hosting are specifically about BP. So this doesn't mean it isn't applicable to 3v3 format, but there is a specific emphasis on maybe different BP mannerisms or nuances. So I encourage you to try to look for those small things that kind of differentiate formats. Clarice, you good? Okay, so I'd like to introduce, sorry, the slides isn't loading for me. Okay, yeah. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Alyssa Salazar, to talk about argument building and case construction.
Okay, just making sure I'm audible and visible. Online debating memories. Okay. I will assume that I am audible and visible if there is no one complaining. Okay, I'll start. All right, so hello everyone. My name is Alyssa Salazar. I'm a member of the Ateneo Debate Society varsity team. Today I'll be presenting my lecture on argument building and case construction. Next slide, please. So this lecture will have 5 main parts. Firstly, we're going to be talking about what are arguments, specifically the goals of arguments within the debate. Secondly, what are the different parts of an argument, which will be divided into 3 portions on elements and what differentiates a good argument from an average one, and also tips for organizing your arguments. Third, we'll be talking about how to generate arguments, especially given the limited time you have in prep. Fourth, we'll be talking about what is credited as a closing extension. So this is ways of giving new analysis at closing, since I think you guys also had some concerns and like questions from the earlier lecture. And fifth, we'll be also talking about how do you build better arguments, some tips and tricks, and how to improve the way that you construct your arguments at the end of the day. Next slide, please. Okay, so first let's go on to what are arguments, specifically the goals, which we can see in the next slide. So there are 3 main goals of arguments. Firstly, arguments are different ways in which you want to win a debate. So this is more of the internal lens, the analysis of your arguments, the depth, the extent, the urgency, the tipping points. Secondly, arguments tell the judge what ought to be valued and credited. So this is more on the external lens. So this is how you weigh those arguments to other impacts and arguments in the round. And this is where you also take into account meta, why it's the most important thing in the debate, and how you want the judge to credit or value that argument at the end. But third, arguments also dissect the motion to concrete and realistic contexts, impacts, analysis, and frames. So this is necessarily important because the emphasis on concrete and realistic means that you as a debater should not assert your arguments, you should not assert your analysis within the round, but you need to prove specifically that your mechanisms lead to your impacts, which we'll explain later on. Let's go on to what are the different parts of an argument. Okay, so there are 7 elements of an argument. First is the label. So this is where you try to show what the argument is trying to prove and what you want the main thing for the round to remember. So this is necessarily important because when your opponents are responding to you, for example, or when the judge is going back in their OA to give their OA on the round, this is usually what they're reciting back to you. Secondly is the premise. Where is this argument coming from and what is the problem we're trying to solve? You also need to define like why necessarily this is true. So you can't necessarily assert that the premise is like the same for every single like context. Third is the mechanism. So it's generally what you hope to change within the round. How do you necessarily change it on your side and why this is exclusive to your side as well. Fourth is the impact. So why does this necessarily matter to the stakeholders in the debate? And why does this make you win relative to other teams? So this is also divided into things like content or the method that you provide within the round. Fifth are preemptions. So what argument is the other team most likely to run? So how do you as well as a speaker mitigate those claims? Sixth is weighing. So how do you position this argument to be the most vital in the round? And 7 are the burdens. This is a bit more implicit, but this is also how you make sure that the strategy you're employing is important. Are you sure that you're arguing the right thing based on your position and the motion to make sure that you're still relevant within the debate? Next slide, please. So since you guys are intermediate to advanced debaters, you probably already know how to formulate arguments. You probably already know the elements that I stated earlier. But I think the following will just generally allow you to strengthen your analysis and make sure that in higher level rooms, for example, you're able to weigh above other teams. So what necessarily are components that differentiate a good argument from an average one? So note that these 3 things aren't necessarily like the only things that can differentiate a good argument from an average one, but these are generally some good like nuances to have within the round. So first is the context. So this is necessarily important because you want to nuance the debate in order to derive easier win conditions. So this is especially also important when the motion is unclear or when your other side is unclear. So you want to be able to limit, for example, the extent of the debate, the extent of what what arguments your opposition might run. But you need to also note that you need to also be quite charitable, so you don't just like squirrel the debate, as what Morty said earlier, but you also need to make sure that you understand that different arguments operate for different contexts. So note who does this context particularly affect and what environment these mechanisms grow in. So for example, the mechanisms in a developing country that needs economic growth is far different, for example, with the mechanisms that you would require, for example, for a developed country. So you need to take into account, for example, the minorities or corruption is more rampant. or necessarily you don't have enough funds to sponsor certain like policies, for example. So you need to nuance the debate to specific contexts in order to show the urgency, for example, of your arguments. But secondly, then, is the comparative nature of arguments. So this is where exclusivity analysis comes in. So you don't just prove, for example, that a harm is likely to occur on opposition side. You need to prove that that harm doesn't exist on your side as well. But in the same manner, you don't just prove that a benefit is likely to occur on your side, but you prove that it doesn't exist on opposition side. So this makes sure that opposition is unable to co-opt your benefits. And it's, I think, also an advantage and as a method to prove the urgency, extent, or the gravity of your impacts. And third, then, is the tipping point. So this is how you explain why the motion is the specific catalyst to induce certain stakeholders to act in crucial ways or to trigger a chain of events. So this also explains like how people think, right? So for example, some actors think about things, but they don't necessarily act on it. And some people may have a fear, for example, but they need a tipping point in order to act on that fear in order to have change within the debate. And this is also important because tipping point can have a compounding nature as well. So for example, government does many things, but it's this thing that we have that when compounded with others makes the change that we want and what government wants to fulfill. So that's also how you're able to compare with other teams as well. Okay, so for next is the part on tips for organizing arguments. Okay, so there are two main tips I would have for organizing arguments. I think firstly, you need to start with the more moderate mechanisms first. So this is necessarily important because if it's already dubious that your mechanism is unlikely to occur, or it's just very hard to believe from the first argument already, it already casts a shadow of doubt for the rest of your argument, since the impression that it makes on other debaters or the judge makes it harder for them to believe. So for example, on mechanisms on like economic motions, for example, the way that you would want to structure it, for example, is 1, it gives people jobs. 2, it leads to better economic development. And then 3, now people from poverty get to uplift themselves. So you don't want to put that last level of people from poverty get to uplift themselves at the very beginning, right? Because you don't necessarily prove the way that people get to that point and the way that they're able to uplift themselves. So that's why you need to prove the prerequisite analysis or the prerequisite mechanisms in order for people from poverty to uplift themselves. So there's also like safeguards against any possible like closing claims, for example, that say like, this is the prerequisite analysis. This is how we win over the opening team. So this makes sure that you necessarily make your arguments more comprehensive as a whole. But secondly, it is also important for intuitive argument selection. So I think what's important to take note is that you must usually, especially if you're a first speaker as well, you need to pick the low-hanging fruit. So this low-hanging fruit is necessarily impacts, for example, benefits, harms that are clear and indisputable. So what it does is that it addresses the immediate burden of the motion. So for example, if it's an argument on like social movements or all of those things, what is the most intuitive like or most certain impact from social movements is that they allow, for example, for people to get, for example, their needs for like food, for example, especially if they're talking about like these necessary policies, etc. But I think like on societal change, you need more mechanisms to prove that. So you just like need to make sure that the low-hanging fruit is already there. So I think also arguments that are independent of deadlock clashes should go first. So this makes sure that the arguments that you present already to the judge are things that they are far more likely to believe and credit at the very beginning, as opposed to arguments that would probably like require more likelihood analysis with other teams. So for example, this also looks like with motions about not patenting tech, right? So you would want to start an argument on specifically accessibility and making sure that people have access to a technology that gives them benefit to their lives and not innovation. Because innovation can be something that can be said like as your second argument, for example, or like comes from as a response from your second speaker. But since innovation is more opposition intuitive and can be disputed immediately, you would want to forward and create a case specifically on things that can't be disputed as easily. So we can go on to the third part, which is how do you generate arguments? Okay, so there are 4 main ways that I usually, or like debaters usually generate arguments. And this is also quite important, especially if you're closing or you generally have a hard time in prep because you're like mental block, for example, or you don't know a lot about the motion. So these are generally ways or strategies that you can employ to make sure that you go through prep efficiently and that you don't get that mental block at the end. So first, and the most common, is an actor-based generation. So this is where you identify the possible stakeholders and figure out how necessarily those policies affect them. So for example, the usual like actor that you want to protect in motions are minorities, because you want to ensure that their needs are catered to, that they aren't being discriminated, that they are given a voice to speak out about their beliefs. So this is also where you like that's I think also debate has a more liberal lens, especially within the Philippine circuit. So by identifying what specific actors are the most vulnerable, for example, you can cater to that lens. But I think it's also quite important that even, for example, without the liberal lens, feel free to also protect stakeholders like corporations, for example, governments, etc. Because you need to prove, especially if you're at closing, for example, and you can't think of like the vulnerable argument analysis, you can prove that other stakeholders are necessarily important. And you can show that since they have more power, for example, within these institutions, it means that those effects trickle down to the minorities, that they're felt at a more massive scale. So that also ensures that you're able to get a multitude of benefits and kind of diversify what actors you want to protect in the motion. Secondly, our issue-based generation. So this is where you identify relevant matters or trends that are also indisputable. So I think this is quite important for international relations or econ debates. So for example, if there are many examples that are given in a motion, you need to find a common denominator to those examples. So let's talk about like a motion that we usually we did in tryouts quite recently, actually, which was this House believes that the Bukele presidency has done more harm than good. So within the info slide, there are things like he has used a militaristic state policy to fight a war against gangs. He had widespread imprisonment, gang crackdowns, and significantly increased the funding of the police. So you can see that there's a lot of examples, and you might feel overwhelmed because you're like, oh my God, it's an IR debate. But you can generally find the common denominator among all of these examples. It's the fact that the dictatorial leadership style is occurring within the Bukele presidency. And for example, there's a lot of human rights violations, which means that minorities are harmed, etc. So that's where you try to, even if, for example, you don't know a lot about the motion, it's the fact that you can find intuitive arguments from the examples that are given or from the general information that you do know about the motion. Or for example, if it's a motion about like the monetary policy of the central bank, and if you know that if you matter load quite well, that there are trending news of the central bank policies, you tie it, for example, to a matter or the trends that you've read up upon. And I think this is also quite important that there's going to be a lecture on matter loading that will be given on in the later sessions, but it's also important to read up on general articles or issues that are going on in society so that you're able to have more depth to your arguments and also make sure that the issue that you bring up within the round are also quite relevant to the motion. But third then are engagement-based generation. So this is where you identify values or impacts that the other side is likely to run. So this is where you then co-opt the value that they have and or you flip the mechanisms that they have to prove, for example, the harms or the benefits on your side. So for example, if it's like a benefit of poverty upliftment, you can show that you're still able to get this on your side. However, this is also quite important that you don't just show that you get it on your side, because in order to avoid running into the problem of making the harm or benefit symmetric, you need to also prove why you get that better on your side. So you prove that even if, for example, opposition is able to get this, we get this as well. And why do we necessarily get it even better? Why do we protect more people, for example? Why do more people get more access to these sort of things? Why do we get more innovation, etc., etc.? So that's also where you prove like incentive analysis, all of those sort of things. And lastly, on analysis-based generation is how you identify layers to arguments and find the end goal to this analysis. So what this necessarily means is that when you're in the beginning of your prep, right, when you're just basically laying down ideas that you have, you're basically just doing brain dumps. Obviously, what you write down won't always be the label of your arguments. It could be the possible layers to your arguments or the impacts, the harms that are underlying, like under a main issue, for example, or a main label. So this is necessarily important that you find, for example, the common denominator as well to the layers that you have inputted. So for example, in a motion about nuclear weapons, for example, that you can, like, if you write down an analysis that says every country having nuclear weapons deters other countries from making inducing like using their nuclear weapons, that's a layer of an analysis. It's not necessarily a main argument. The main argument in that case, then, if you continue going through that analysis and finding the end goal to that analysis, is that the main goal is to lessen conflict. So that makes sure that the most important claim is what you put as your label, for example. So lessen conflict is your main label, and underneath that, every country having nuclear weapons deters other countries, which makes sure you have like a good premise for your argument. Or also, for example, on an argument about banning zoos or the motion of banning zoos. So a layer to that analysis is that migration patterns of animals are disrupted. So this is a good impact. It's a good harm, for example, for you to prove. But the main layer or the main big picture that you want to prove is that it inherently harms animals, their biological nature, etc. So that's what you put as the main claim. So there are certain strategies you need to employ to make sure that what you put as your label is something that resonates well with the judge, resonates well with the round, is something that is received well and will be responded quite well, as opposed to having a weaker label, for example, to your arguments that makes it harder, for example, for other teams to engage, etc. So let's go then on what is credited as a closing extension. So I think within high school debaters specifically, I think a lot of people get nervous when they are closing, because they're like, oh my gosh, opening was so good, I don't know what to run anymore, all of those things. But I think what's quite important is generally intuitive arguments are likely to be taken up by opening, but what you can do specifically on closing is that you can expound more on it, but you also have more time, for example, to get more harms, benefits, impacts, etc. So specifically, I want to note that with this going deep versus casting wide analysis, I want to note that a lot of this content was derived from Ateneo Debate Camp 2021. So shout out to Irene, who is just an alumni of the ADS. I'll just re-emphasize it here so that you guys can gain this knowledge as well. So there are generally two ways that you go about in closing. So first is going deep, which is like vertical analysis, and secondly is casting wide. So the way that you usually structure, for example, your arguments when you're doing vertical is that you have a label, right? You have the premise, why is it true? How does this manifest? And what's specific to going deep argumentation is that you have to provide as many manifestations as necessary to, for example, the harm that you're trying to prove. So then afterwards you prove why this is so bad. The difference then with a casting wide or a horizontal analysis is that you prove many different mechanisms that lead to many different outcomes. So X happens as a consequence of the motion. This is true for XYZ. There's harm 1, harm 2, harm 3. So this is also good if your opening has already went deep in their opening argument. So what you do then as closing is that you do a more casting wide technique. But if for example, your opening just goes horizontal, you can also do more vertical analysis at closing. So for example, on this house would ban zoos. Going deep analysis would have the main argument that zoos are bad for animals. And then the mechanisms for this are that zoos are underfunded. Zoos provide poor habitat and diet options. Zoos place animals in harm's way due to close proximity to humans. Zoos domesticate animals, changes their behavior. The appearance of animals are changed due to malnutrition, etc., etc. This argument is relevant because we ban things when 1, they cause active harm to people, and 2, they don't fulfill their intended purpose. But on casting wide, on the other hand, you have argument 1, zoos are inhumane. And the different harms you have underneath that, it's inhumane for animals, that humans shouldn't have moral ascendancy over animals. We give rights because we want to minimize the amount of suffering experienced, therefore we should respect them. Second harm then, it propagates harmful narratives. You propagate dominion over animals, for example, especially to kids who are impressionable beings, and it's bad for environmentalism and how you get more people to opt into the environmental movement. But third, it's also a waste of land. That's the third harm that you have. So large hectares of land in metropolitan areas takes away from other businesses. It's not socially utile. So you see that the main difference is that the casting wide ensures that you have more diversity in your arguments, but the first one ensures that you're able to get as many impacts or harms that you're able to show the judge, and that you should also be able to weigh this over other things. For example, other ways that you can have a closing extension, which we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is also where we can use the components that we used earlier for what makes a good argument versus an average one. So you can use those like ways as well and those components to make sure that you can also weigh over like your opening, for example. So it's on one, the specific context. You can say that your opening theme doesn't nuance the context. If they talk more about the developed world, you explain specifically why the developing world is the most important like actor, for example, in the motion, why the impacts that you provide then are the most important because it's tied to those specific contexts, because it's tied to that specific actor. So for example, it's the most vulnerable, it's the most urgent, all of those things. So you just explain why the context is most important, and that's where you lay the foundation for your arguments later on. But secondly, you can also prove that the opening theme doesn't prove the comparative, for example. So you explain on your side on like as closing the exclusivity of your new impacts or why opposition, for example, can't co-opt your benefits. And this is entirely important because if opening already is like flimsy in their case, like even for example, they provide a lot of impacts, you prove why you're able to safeguard all of those impacts and make sure it's only exclusive to your side. But third is that the opening theme doesn't prove the tipping point. So you explain why the mechanism creates a certain chain of events. You explain why other themes like don't necessarily like they prove that this change is likely to occur, but they don't prove that they'll get people to act to that change. So you prove that you get like the impact, for example, or the benefit, the harm, etc. So I think those necessarily are quite important. So you can see that how you make your arguments could also show how you weigh over other teams as well. So I think it's not as intimidating as you guys might think. I think closing is very strategic, especially if you want to have like a more like widespread view of the round and you want to generally have arguments that engage more as well. I think another way that you do this is that you make arguments that you respond quite well to opening and like what opposition might have, since opening might have your opening theme might have focused more on like making intuitive arguments. At least yours are more engaging within the round and like goes with the certain clashes or issues, which makes it also easier for the judge to like weigh those arguments since they know that they're direct clashes as well. So it's good also for strategy at the end. Okay, so for the fifth part is how do you build better arguments and the necessary tips that I think are quite important. Okay. Sorry, next slide, please. Okay, so there are three main tips. I have one more after like these specific tips, but I think the first step on making better arguments is that you need to understand that the bigger the impact, the harder it is to prove. So I think a common like tendency of like high school debaters is that they want to go for the big impact because they think that this is the most important impact in the round. It affects the most number of people. But I think you also need to remember that the bigger impact you have, it also makes it like harder to believe to the judge. So what you need to do is that you need to mechanize sufficiently the kinds of arguments that you have, and you need to ensure that you clearly demonstrate only the most strategic and important impacts. So you can also like this also ensures that you have you need to also make sure, by the way, that you have many mechanisms to prove that impact. So if you have like a really big impact, you can't just have like one mechanism as your pathway to victory because it's easy then for opposition to disprove you. So what you can do is that you have many mechanisms that lead to your pathway to victory. So even, for example, opposition disproves one mechanism, you have other mechanisms to prove its likelihood of occurring. But I think secondly as well, it's quite important to understand the timeline of how an argument takes place. So this is generally like your usual like long-term versus short-term analysis. So the limit with this is that you as a debater usually need to weigh speculative versus certain impacts. So for example, if it's against like the long term, right? What's speculative as what if you're like you can say, for example, what's speculative is like businesses or like individuals, for example, surviving economic drains. But what's certain is that business stimulus is important so that you can have enough resources in the short term to have like to feed your family, etc. I think this is also important for grounding. So you need to like show if your argument or your impacts affect people immediately, or does it gradually improve the condition of people through time? So this is also how you're able to safeguard possible rebuttals to it. It's like your principles won't feed you, your like ideals, for example, won't feed you. So I think it's important that you show that how your ideals, for example, gradually improve the situation of people or the social realities that people experience through time. So that's necessarily important as well, so that you're able to ground your arguments. But I think third, it's important to be realistic and concrete. So you need to ask yourselves, one, is this argument logically true? So for example, don't operate in debate land where it's like, if I prove this 10 billion likelihoods, then it'll just like occur. But you need to show, for example, its nuances to reality. And you need to show, for example, that there are physical manifestations. Don't get stuck in all of the technical terms, but I think ways that you can prove arguments can be seen in like the lived realities of people. And that also makes sure that you're able to have like a more like societal impact side to how you approach debate as well. But I think also what's important to ask within debates is if it's the most relevant issue that the motion is asking us to discuss. Because I think within motions, there are a lot of issues that you can discuss, and a lot of ways that you can analyze certain motions. But I think what you need to like genuinely think about when you are in prep or you're within the round is, why did AdScore make this motion, right? Because AdScore is usually like, they're people as well, they're debaters, but they also experience like the social issues that are happening in society. They also read, for example, like similar articles that are going on. So you need to tie it back to how you approach like what you read, for example, as matter briefs, or what like other debates have done in the past, or like what are important in like society right now. So I think that's also important so that you're able to tie it back to reality. But I think a fourth tip that's not included in the PowerPoint slide is that I also, in order to become better at formulating arguments and in order to like find what is the most intuitive or the most strategic argument, is that you as a debater need to practice thinking or case building within short periods of time. So I think the way that you can do this in a more applicational sense is, one, you can do things like blitz prep. So it's, for example, doing like 5-minute prep instead of 15-minute prep and giving a speech right after. So obviously in the beginning, you're like, wow, my speech is so bad. Like there's not like so many things missing from it. Like how do people even do this? But as you like make sure like you're able to prep within shorter periods of time, that's also how you're able to formulate like analysis at a quicker pace, where you're able to be on the spot, for example, that even if, for example, you don't have a lot written on your notes, you're able to think on the spot. And I think that's quite important. But I think secondly, this is something that Miko Vito taught me as well. In order to have a better sense of how the round is going to go and what like important arguments you need to have, one exercise you can do is going on hellomotions.com. So if you guys don't know, hellomotions.com is like a database of motions that like you can get random motions, you can get motions from specific topics. But what he told me is that you can click on the randomized motion, I forgot, like the randomized option, like motion option. And then when you see that motion, think of at least 3 arguments for each side. So you can do this like you can take as long as you want, etc. But obviously the goal is to get like more efficient at like thinking of arguments. So what this does is that since you think of 3 arguments for government side, you think of 3 arguments for opposition, it allows you to think quicker, and it also allows you to see what general arguments both sides are going to run, so that within actual debates, you already know, for example, once you see the emotion, okay, these are the intuitive claims I would run as PM. These are what opposition is likely to run. Here are some preemptions I can have in order to safeguard my case. So it allows you to have a better grasp of motions so that you can see the intuitive arguments and responses to the debate so that you can already safeguard this from PM already. So I think those are the general tips I would provide. If you guys have other questions, you can feel free to mention them in the chat, because that's my lecture for today. Thank you, guys. Okay, we can... you can go to the Q&A slide just so that people know. You
Hi,
can...
everyone. Oh,
Yes. Okay.
okay.
Yeah.
So, same procedure. You can raise your hand through the Zoom, or you can just send a private message to me or Alyssa directly. For the people that submitted, let's say like in the previous lecture but were unanswered, I didn't really keep track of that. So if you want to ask kind of the same question again, just feel free to do so, but you just have to send that in. Okay. Okay, I got a question. Is there ever really too much time trying to prove one argument for like 5 minutes when you could have just said this and that and still have time for a second argument? I can message you the question
Yeah, sorry, I was
anonymously. I
okay.
am protecting your identity. Don't worry.
Okay, I'm assuming this is about making sure that you are strategic with how you present your arguments. So I think with regard to proving an argument for 5 minutes, if it takes you 5 minutes, I don't think it's the most strategic thing to already have this, especially if you are like an opening team. So I think if it depends kasi if like what your speaker role is. So if you're closing and you try to prove that argument for 5 minutes, I think it'll be better for you since that obviously like that already includes how you weigh over the other teams. And especially if it's a harder to believe impact, but it has greater like impacts, for example, I think it's good if you're closing and you're focusing on doing that argument for 5 minutes. But if you're opening, right, and you're PM and you're spending 5 minutes on one argument, I just suggest that you scrap that strategy. I think what you should do is that you should at least have like 2 to 3 arguments at PM. And this already makes sure that you have the intuitive analysis out, you have all the foundational analysis out, and this makes sure that you're able to safeguard against like possible responses from other teams as well, and like what your closing might say. So I think it's better. It depends on your position around. But basically, on opening, focus on running more intuitive and more arguments, and on closing, run more like depth arguments as well. Okay. Secondly, how can we efficiently mechanize an argument without overdoing it? So I think I like to think in rules of threes. I think if you watch my speeches or if you watch my OAs, for example, I usually go like by threes. So I think this is also good because like general mental calculus, like what people generally remember in rounds. I think if your worry is that you're mechanizing too much, I think just limit it to 3 main mechanisms that are the most important to that argument. And then prove why those mechanisms get you to your impacts the most. So I think just like lay it down to what is most important to the debate. I think yes, this is not completely related, but I think the recording of the session will be here. I think they'll upload it naman, or they'll give you a link. Okay. So what can you do when you don't have that much idea about emotion? How can you make convincing arguments then? So I think this is where we tie in what I said earlier about how do you generate arguments. So even if, for example, you're in like an IR debate or an econ debate that you don't know much about, you generally know, for example, that developed nations try to take advantage of like things in developing nations, or developing nations have less resources to fund certain policies or to like have political will, or they have more corrupt systems. So you think of like intuitive cases that you would usually run for other arguments. I think also think about like what people are generally going through in order to like show, like, even for example, you don't know a lot about the motion. You know that mass killings are bad. You know that dictatorial rule is bad. You know that people not having a voice is bad. So even, for example, you don't do like spec matter, you can tie in those harms to what you already know about the motion. And especially if you're closing, you have the benefit of like hearing what other teams say on like spec matter and then applying that to your speeches. But obviously, I still recommend that you guys read up on matter and make sure that you know what issues are happening on in the world. Okay. Is it advisable to split arguments with your partner? Like, for example, my partner focuses on these arguments while I focus on other arguments, or will this make things worse for your side? My general rule of thumb is that if you're in prep as opening, and if you already think those arguments as like DLO, for example, it's usually best if you give those arguments to first speaker. But I think if you really want to split those arguments, put the most important arguments in the beginning, right? So for example, you think of 4 arguments and you're like, okay, that's way too much. Like you need to have the most strategic arguments in the debate. So what you do is that what I told you earlier about the tips for organizing arguments. You start with the moderate mechanisms, what's easier to believe. You start with the intuitive argument selection. But if you only have, for example, you only think of 2 arguments as opening, then I think it's far better if you give both of those arguments to your first speaker, because that makes sure that you already have that in the beginning of the debate. And if you, as second speaker in opening, don't really like have arguments or extensions to think about, you can focus more on engaging and weighing what you do have already with the rest of the debate. So I think in terms of like how you employ that within the debate, I think it ensures that you're able to be comprehensive. Is there a recommended way on structuring member speeches if you want to run vertical extensions and a horizontal extension you prepared beforehand, or should you focus more towards vertical or horizontal, which you can also apply if opening may force you to switch priority or strategy? Okay. So I think generally, like, it's okay naman if you have both a vertical and a horizontal extension. But I think generally what you need, like, okay, give me a moment. I think what you need to do is that if you have both extensions, you need to make sure that what's the more relevant extension in comparison to what your opposition already said. So even if, for example, you have a vertical or a horizontal extension, which extension engages more with the debate? So even if you have a very well-built extension, if you don't have enough time to prove why it's important in a debate, then it's easy for you to get boxed out, especially if it's like horizontal, right? But if that's why you need to make sure that your extension is situated well in the debate. So if you have like, if in terms of structuring, prioritize those that engage more with what the opening opposition, for example, already said, so that allows you to have like relevance within the round. And then you weigh those arguments with what your opening said and how it responds to opposition. And you need to say it quite explicitly so that the judge can take note of it as well. Because as what Morty said, like other circuits don't necessarily credit vertical extensions as much. So you need to give more weighing, for example, for how that's going to be the case. Okay. Wait, sorry. Okay, if physical manifestation of arguments is important in a debate round, how about if we just assume or posit that your proposals are going to happen? Because there are times when most cases are just being based off reasonable materials or framing of their paradigm, but not going to happen in the real world. I think like people, like you generally have your intuition, right? So for example, if the premise is like, poor people are disadvantaged in society, poor people don't have resources to or like access to resources, that's an intuitive claim. That's a physical manifestation that you don't need to prove a lot in order for people to believe that. So I think intuitively, like, does an average reasonable voter, for example, believe this without like extra mechanization? Then that's a good like premise to have in order to show that like that's an important argument. So I think just use your intuition to like which premises, or like even if it's not your intuition, right? As debaters, you have seen a multitude of like debates already happen. You know what like judges usually buy, you know what debaters usually buy. So if you see the trend of certain premises being credited even without a lot of mechanization, you can use that to your advantage just to make sure that you have better like time management as well. Okay. How do you have specific tips or strategies in identifying the most important or prioritize analysis to the least important one? Since I usually find it difficult to have priority on explaining more stuff when there is a lot of things to think and say. Okay. So I mentioned this earlier, but I think what is the most important or prioritized analysis? Usually it's like the low-hanging fruit. So this makes sure that you have like the clear and indisputable impact. So that usually is the most important, especially if you're an opening team. But I think what's also quite important is how you engage with the other teams as well. So it's what I said earlier about if your argument is situated well in the debate, that makes it like easier for you to prioritize that, since you have to spend like less time on proving that to the judge. It ensures that you're relevant within the debate. But and like if it's a really big impact, for example, that requires a lot of mechanisms, but you know, even if okay, if it's a big impact that requires a lot of mechanisms, but you know it's going to be able to weigh above other teams in terms of like just extents and urgency, then you can also prioritize that through your analysis if you think that's going to be like winning a debate winning and you're able to mechanize it quite well. So it's really about what's happening within the round, so that you're able to make sure that it's relevant within the debate. Okay, I think those are the questions from my end.
All right. Everyone give Alyssa a heart react for an amazing lecture. Yay, thank you. Okay. So, thank you, Alyssa, for your lecture. So now we proceed with our last lecture. I hope you guys are still awake or are still energetic. So our last lecture is about strategy and the BP format specifically, and it will be given by our actually current ADS president, Beatrice Cuizon. Yay! Clarice, are the slides ready?
Bea, can you give me access to your slides? I requested access.
My bad. Pause. Teka. Can I just resend the slide?
Ah, yeah, you can messenger it.
Send it na, Clarice. Thank you. I hope you're all still with me. It's like, I understand that I'm last, and it's actually quite late. Thank you for coming. Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name is Bea. As you may know, yes, I am the current president of the Ateneo Debate Society. I've been doing competitive debate for around 8 years. Some of you may know me because maybe you went to PSDC and I was able to judge you. But for today, we're going to be talking about strategy, specifically through the lens of British parliamentary format. I am assuming that all of you know the British parliamentary format and I guess the basics of debating. And to be fair, even if you're preparing for, let's say, an Asian parliamentary tournament, or you are someone that does frequently debate in that format, I do think that most of the tips naman in this lecture will still apply. Okay. Next slide, please. First, let's talk about prep. I labeled every part like in a jokey way, but let's first talk about the 15 minutes of prep that you are given. Next slide, please. So what is the ideal in prep time? Given the 15 minutes that you are provided each round, it is not realistic to expect that you will cover every possible argument. And even for the limited cases, burdens, and arguments that you choose to take on as a specific person in that debate or as a specific team in that debate, it's not realistic to expect that you will be able to cover everything. Therefore, I do think that there are 3 essential points that at the end of the 15 minutes or the 30 minutes, depending again on what format we're doing here, you have 3 things that are covered. The first is you want to create a specific direction for the case. I think the meta, perhaps in the past 1 or 2 years, was very focused on spamming as many reasons as possible. I do think that there are speakers, much like myself, that still emanate that trend, or that still reflect that trend or still reflect that meta. But what I'm realizing now, or at least I realized this sometime around Vietnam WDC, is that there is a regression, less of a regression and more back of a discipline in terms of trying to not run everything and instead run maybe 2 or 3 things that contribute to a greater benefit and a greater theme and strategy throughout the 2 speeches of your team, and learning how to run those 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 impacts and or arguments quite well in terms of meeting the minimum burdens in order to prove its truth value, in order to address, for example, specific mechanisms that unlock the full potential and the full benefit of the full harm of the claim that you are making. I'm going to be talking about that a lot more later on. But it is important in terms of prep to be able to understand where you exactly want to go and what you exactly want to prove. And that's largely because I do think that there are some arguments that are in tension with each other in terms of what you're trying to prove. So like, do you, let's say in an econ debate, do you privatize or do you not privatize? Do you maximize market efficiency, or do you prioritize, for example, consumers, other things like that? And sometimes I do think some mechanisms may come into contradiction with each other and may affect a judge's ability to perceive your case as one that is cohesive and worth crediting. Second, I think it's also agreeing on the stance. So it's not just about like whether or not you are for or not in for the motion, because obviously that's quite intuitive, right? Because you're put in government or opposition. But I think it's more about agreeing to specific instances of the stance. So for example, in emotion about, let's say, this house regrets the culture of forgiveness or something like that. It's like, are you willing to agree with the stance of all instances of forgiveness? Is it just instances where forgiveness is for forgiveness that is acceptable, like forgiving someone that made an honest mistake, that made a white lie, for example? Or is it forgiveness to the extent that it is forgiveness about historical revisionism, forgetting people that have committed major atrocities, forgiving people that have abused you? And I think aligning yourself on what type of examples you want to focus upon and you're willing to defend on your end is important. But obviously, at the end of the day, I will always advocate for arguing in favor of the hard stance or the hard line stance. But finally, I think this is important, is outlining arguments in terms of who will run what. So what is the PM approach going to be? What is the DPM approach going to be? What should we expect the DPM to be able to highlight from the PM speech? And I'm not saying that you should outline all the arguments in terms of having a full rundown of what you're supposed to say, though I understand if in OG that's probably important and speed is key. But for the very limited 15 minutes that you are given, it's at bare minimum important to have the header of the argument, what you need to prove under that argument. And then the expectation is when you go into that debate room, you individually can fill out those lines or those parts, on your own. And I understand that may be hard for people at the novice level. Believe me when I say that it was hard for me even when I went into university. But I do think over time, as you do more case builds, you do more debates, you become more accustomed with similar themes and similar arguments, and you start to notice that some things are built in a similar way, with the exception of some nuances in maybe examples or weighing or burdens of proof or characterizations or incentives. It does become a lot easier over time. Next slide, please. Okay, the one before that, please. Okay, so there are several roles that you can take in a team, but I do think the main two ones are devil's advocate and prep leader. So I don't necessarily think that you have to have this like very clean cut, like you have to be devil's advocate and you have to be prep leader all the time. But I do think in terms of how you guys approach, it is really just indicative that there should be instances where you try to dictate the direction of the case. And there should be instances where also, while you are doing that, you are trying to poke holes in the case and welcome room for doubt, because that room for doubt inspires you to create a more solid case that is able to withstand any potential response that comes from the opposing side. So let's explore that idea a little further. Let's start with the devil's advocate. Next slide. The idea behind the devil's advocate is that they should create an iron solid case. And so they find holes in the case which identifies areas of improvement and prepares the team for potential responses or POIs. So normally this would look like, for example, you are making a case for a motion and you're spitballing all of these arguments and all of these frames and all of these characterizations. But a devil's advocate would probably be the type of person to go like, but what if op responds in this way? What if the judge perceives it as this way? What if the judge perceives argument 1 and argument 2 to be contradictory to each other? And that encourages you to think of ways to either circumvent that problem, avoid that problem entirely, or prevent that problem from happening. So normally the process of being a devil's advocate results in you being able to create an additional level of response or an additional level of preemption that would be able to insulate your case from responses, or should those responses be run at opposition, they essentially would just be less impactful because you've already addressed them, and essentially just takes away time from what could have been stronger material on the opposing side. The flip of this is the prep leader. Next slide, please. Who is expected to mostly direct the case. And so obviously they outline the potential case line. They may be the first to shoot potential arguments. But in my opinion, the most important part of the prep leader is the person that also puts a sense of urgency to the 15 minutes. And I think this is because in the process of doing prep time in BP, it is very natural that you and your partner are going to fight over something. You might fight over the stance, you might fight over the model, you might fight over which argument to prioritize first. And even if you're not fighting over something, you might have the tendency to fixate over how to build an argument. And while I do agree that it is quite important to make sure that you have arguments lined up and lined out so that, again, like I said a while ago, when you come into the prep room, you can build it for yourself. That tends to result in people pigeonholing at the expense of covering other material and being unable to fully flesh out an argument, such that one argument is super well built, but then thereafter it's just like it's like nothing, right? So beyond trying to get more well versed in being quicker, being snappier, having arguments come more intuitively to you, I do think that part of it also is having someone that is willing to say, wait, let's move on, let's cover this again later, and if not, we can just solve it in the round or something like that. So it's taking note of the time, being cognizant if you are a lot more behind than you should be in terms of prep, and making sure that you too pick up the pace throughout those 15 minutes so that no minute is wasted. I think this is especially true also because some people's prep style, especially maybe in a more intermediate setting, is that they tend to ramble on. But obviously, especially if you and your partner have been training for a really long time, which is, I mean, obviously there are cases where you are sometimes partnering up with people you've never partnered up before. But in most cases, in a competitive setting, you've been partnering up with this person for a long time. You probably have a rough idea of how they run an argument, or you have a rough idea of what they do know and what they don't know. I will talk about later, like how this is reflexive and how people should also be honest with what they do and don't know. But you individually have an idea of their strengths and weaknesses. And therefore, you might also have an idea of when you don't need to really explain an argument. Like if you know that your partner is an econ god or is very well versed in feminism, I don't think you need to spend time without outlining one by one what are the characteristics of a competitive market, or what does economies of scales mean, or in the case that they're a feminist expert, you don't need to outline to them examples of how women experience oppression in the workplace or in media, etc. Because I'm sure that if you just say run this and then something like explain how women are oppressed in the media, I'm sure they can run like they can build that claim to sufficiency. So again, it's about knowing your partner and knowing what you need to move on from. And similarly, if you are the person that is being fed material and you already know that you can build this material well, then be alert, be aware, be honest. Tell your partner, I know how to run this already. Let's move on. Okay? So I think given that 15 minutes is very short, the reason why people feel like they run out of time is because they're not really approaching prep from a lens of optimum efficiency. They're running it through the lens of let's just make arguments, which I guess if you were in AP or WSDC and you had 30 minutes to an hour, I guess that's fine. But for BP, where it's only 15 minutes, you don't have the luxury of time. Next slide. Sorry, back. No. This is correct. Sorry. Yes. Notes on synergy. So I already covered this prior. This is maximizing the 15 minutes. Being honest is important. Concision is key, and read the motion. So I already heavily covered about being honest. I think another example in which this is important is if you don't understand something, like when I was doing UADC with Riva Fong and Rivaldo Aquino, and I didn't understand like a single thing about some green energy something in Bhutan, and I was first speaker and Riva was second speaker, and Riva was trying to explain it to me, and I think it's like 2 months at 2 minutes have elapsed. I still don't understand it. I was like, Riv, can you just take this, please? And that's okay. Like as a deputy, you have to kind of, as a deputy or a whip, you kind of have to suck it up and recognize that you are going to be responsible for whatever your first doesn't end up saying. Obviously, this goes both ways, and first speakers should be able to do their job properly. But for second speakers, you should be able to recognize or know your first speaker's speech or have an idea of what they're supposed to be saying, and recognize when after the end of their speech they missed out an argument or two, or an important weighing or two, or an important characterization like that you think is genuinely important to the case, and it is your responsibility to bring it up and rebuild it and make sure it's clear at your speech. Okay, so just because they didn't run it doesn't necessarily mean it's not your problem anymore. Of course it's still your problem, it's your case, it is a team. Indeed. So just note to be honest with each other on what you can and cannot run. If you also, as a prime minister or as a first speaker, for example, you know for a fact that you have 3 arguments, you only have 7 minutes. For 1 and 2 are quite robust. Sometimes you're LO and you still have to make room for responses. You probably won't be able to run the 3rd argument. So you have to communicate to your deputy that, hey, I might not be able to fully run the 3rd argument. So if ever, can you please run it in deputy? And then if you know for a fact you weren't able to run it, the moment you sit down, you tell them, I didn't run argument 3, or show them your paper, highlight what you didn't run, give it to them so they can write it on their own paper, so they can send it, say it during their speech. A note on this slide though is that what you do before prep is just as important as what you do during prep. And what I specifically mean by this is the training that you do outside is just as important as actually going to the tournament. And I don't mean like do prep tournaments, as much as I do agree that that is important. I mean things like case building, matter loading, watching debates. I think there needs, in the same way that we expect sports athletes, like real sports athletes, to follow a strict diet regimen or go to the gym or maintain a healthy body, avoid injury, not overstress their muscles. The same thing should be expected out of a debater that is competitive and serious about improving. You should make an effort to re-engineer your phone, your social media, your email, so that you are constantly consuming updated knowledge about the world. You should make an effort to watch debates so that you can learn more about how people argue, set up, strategize, and approach a debate. And the reason for this is because when you go into those 15 minutes, there's so much time that you will end up wasting trying to flip through your little matter file, trying to control F on your online document, trying to remember what this specific political landscape in this specific African country is. But if you already are well prepped and it's almost like muscle memory in terms of what you know about the world, then the active recall comes a lot easier, and you save so much time in all of those little things, and instead spend that time integrating what you actually know and what you've actually learned outside of prep towards the actual prep, which again saves a lot of time in the very, very, very little 15 minutes that you have. Before I proceed, sorry, next slide, just to check if there's a next slide. Okay, before I proceed to hedging risk, are there any questions? Okay, none. Let's talk about hedging risk. What this part is really about is that if you were to lose, there are many reasons for why you can lose a debate. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, if I were to lose a round, I would want it to be for the actual value of my content, and I wouldn't want it to be because the judge did not understand my speech such that my perception of how the strategy was and what the argument is very different from their conception of what my case is. And therefore, things on clarity, notes on clarity, and notes on, to call this, Notes on clarity, yeah, are very important. So let's explore that idea more. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the bare minimums that you should be expecting out of crafting a case and crafting a strategy. Let's first talk about setup. So you want to consider the following things. The first is intuitiveness of the motion. Does the debate demand a clear model policy comparative? Make the debate clear and secure for you. So signposting, I think, is very important. What I've noticed with a lot of speakers, at least when I was in PSTC, is that a lot of them were adopting a very, how do I say, stream of consciousness type of speaking. I don't think it's inherently bad, but I think the reality is that it's very difficult often for the average judge or for most judges to be able to follow a stream of consciousness type of speaking in terms of a debate, often because, a judge is trying to listen to your speech, take notes about your speech in real time, and process their own opinions about your speech in real time. And if you're a latter speaker, they're trying to relate your content to the content that has come out thus far. So there's a lot of like mental gymnastics that a judge is undergoing mid-round. And, having a speech that they have to segment for themselves and organize for themselves in order for them to understand is also an addition to that cognitive load. So for me, my personal perspective is that to do them a favor and to make it easier for me to be understood, it's important to signpost in terms of argument 1, this is what I want to prove first, 3 reasons, 111, next thing to prove, 111, etc., etc. Going back to the concept of synergies and devil's advocates, be disciplined and ask yourself if it is relevant. So it's important that to recognize and concede that you will not be able to run everything. But in terms of what you want to prove, you want to really think about what you want to end up running. And if you believe that that response or that level, that mechanism or that whatever doesn't fit into the greater image of the case, then you are probably better off not running it. Next slide. Okay. In the interest of time, I will skip this. Next slide, please. Next, let's talk about analysis and argumentation. So what do you want to prove? What does this analysis or argument affect? And what problem do you intend on solving? This is just very basic, like what do you want to prove in terms of the argument? And then in terms of looking at analysis and arguments and what problem do you intend on solving. I think when you really think about it, sometimes a debate is boiled down to a problem that you intend to solve through a specific motion. And I think that's another way to view debates should you be stuck in terms of prep. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. I just want to give a few notes on preemption. So obviously it's important because it creates engagements and it applies pressure. You want to also sometimes clarify trade-offs. Sometimes you also want to refute claims and make space for your second speaker. So again, like I said a while ago, it allows you to already respond to claims from opposing side before they even come out. So in the event that it does come out, then a smart judge would deem it irrelevant because it was already preempted, or it would be easy for your second speaker to say, well, my first speaker preempted this, not important, let's cover something else. You want a note on this though is that you want to preempt what's obvious and intuitive. What I've been noticing lately is that sometimes speakers, I think, will always start their speech with a preemption. And sometimes the preemption is something that's like 2 degrees removed from what the intuitive case is. And for me, even if you're like PM or LO, which to me is kind of like, why would you prioritize the preemption first? I think it's important to set the ground for your case, even if you're closing. It's all the more important in closing. And cover the framing, cover the point of the case, cover the basic impact you want to achieve. Preemptions exist to supplement existing argumentation and framing. I don't think it should be the framing itself. And often if it comes first, it's not clear because the argument, you need to prove the argument and the framing first normally in order for the preemption to make sense. And additionally, I think you have to want to preempt what's obvious and intuitive. Like you don't want to confuse the judge, or you don't want to give the opponent arguments. I think an example of this is like, let's say, in the world, in the motion, this house would legalize drugs. Obviously, up or it was gonna go something like people are gonna become addicts or something like that, or it's gonna encourage addictive behavior. So obviously, you're gonna make an argument on why legalizing drugs itself is good, but somewhere there you want to sprinkle that. Okay, so obviously, opposition is going to say that people are probably it's gonna encourage addictive behavior. Here's what we say about that. And don't make an effort to like get super duper creative with it. I think in super potentially wild, anomalous responses, creative responses, the likelihood of that appearing from the opposing side is very, very, very low, or like not so likely. So I don't think it's worth preempting. You are better off just preempting what is very likely to come out, and then just have your deputy be, or your whip or whatever, be very prepared to respond to those creative, anomalous, or wild examples. Next slide, please. Panic buttons. So I understand that there might be cases wherein you don't understand a debate, either because the motion is confusing, the info slide is confusing, or it's like something like econ and IR, or something you're not really well read about, and then you don't understand. So here is how you can potentially navigate it. Next. When in doubt, you probably want to view prep through the following questions. This is the most generalist approach I could suggest. I do think that ways to do this could depend on the theme, especially if it's like economics or development. But from a general sense, it's like, one, where is this motion likely to take place? Two, do we know of specific real world examples of this debate? And three, at its core, what is this debate asking us to weigh? And if you notice throughout the 3 bullet points, it's really just questions on that are encouraging you to imagine where this debate is taking place and specific examples. And the reason for this is because I think when you are able to attribute this debate or this topic to specific kinds of instances where it has happened already, then you can extrapolate already like a policy, like a setup. You can extrapolate examples and intuition prompts, and also extrapolate pros and cons of a specific policy or a specific belief or motion. For example, like I'm sure we've had motions before on like this house, maybe something like this house would abolish all private schools. And I agree, I don't really think that's specifically hard, a specifically hard motion, but I think it becomes easier. It becomes easier to imagine that motion take place when you really think about like, what school do you go to? If it's public or private, what struggles do you go through? If you know someone in your life that goes to a public or private school, what struggles do they go through? Have you known someone that has transferred from a public or private school? What do they confront? And things like that. And while I don't think we should be arguing by example or like, trauma dumping in our arguments, I do think it is through the real world, and when we observe the real world, that we can extrapolate different forms of analysis, like in terms of explaining characterizations or incentives of different types of actors, or how specific actions could affect, different aspects of emotion and different moving parts. Next slide. Okay, this is a note on hard motions. So I don't necessarily think that what I'm about to suggest is necessarily life-saving. Like there's no way you can fluff through an IR round if it's about like the Middle East or about Sub-Saharan Africa. Sometimes the only way to win is just to actually know something about the round. But for a lot of motions, there are human aspects to it, even in like seemingly development or med tech or econ spec, whatever motions. Because at its core, debate is about persuasiveness, and rhetoric is a part of it. And for next slide, the motion under it is one that I would really like to give an example on. So this was, I think, round 3 of ABP 2023. It's this house believes that countries with public healthcare systems should not subsidize life-extending treatments for the elderly or those with terminal illnesses. And obviously, right, just reading the motion, government is going to come up and they're going to give all of this like economic hullabaloo about maximizing profit or maximizing efficiency, scarce resources, and all that economic hullabaloo. I was CEO in this round, and yes, opening opposition also tried to engage with the economic hullabaloo. And we did too, because obviously it's important. Sometimes there are things that you really need to engage upon. But I think importantly, a way that we extended in this motion was really appealing to people's emotions and lived experiences. Because while this motion technically is about, you know, subsidies and allocation of finite resources, it is also about extending life for elderly and people with terminal illnesses. And it is really a common human experience to watch your grandmother or grandfather be thrown into hospice care or into the home for the aged. Or, you know, it's a common phenomenon in the Western world where for many patients that often get dementia, they continue to live a life, but it's a life that is undignified because you soil yourself, you forget your loved ones, you can't listen to music anymore. All the things that make you human are things that are slowly stripped away from you as a result of this life, as a result of this terminal illness or this life-threatening illness. And the extension that we gave is that it is important for public healthcare systems to subsidize life-extending treatments, because we believe that number one, it is a part of human life to enjoy it to its fullest. When you are hit with a terminal illness or you are hit with something like Alzheimer's and dementia, it removes your human dignity because you are unable to enjoy the things that make you humane. You're unable to meaningfully engage in the relationships that you once loved back when you didn't have this disease. And second, it's important that it has to be through public healthcare systems, because the alternatives don't exist for the people that only have access to public health care. If you're poor, if you're a member of the working class, if you are drowning in debt, you don't have access to a private doctor, you don't have access to a private hospital. That's for most of the privileged world. But for you, what this motion is implying on government is that the ability to live a dignified life the moment you reach 60, the moment you are given a terminal illness, is one that is only a privilege as opposed to a right, and we reject that premise entirely. So obviously that doesn't fully encapsulate the way we approach that argument, but it demonstrates that there is a way to approach seemingly more spec and seemingly harder motions with an angle that is admittedly fluffy, but can still be compelling because, well, allegedly it's compelling because we got first in that round. But that's another way to look at it. I don't think that when you come into a round and it's so hard, or it looks so hard and looks so spec, you should feel like there's no way that you can win, or that even if you don't know anything about econ, you should force yourself. Well, I do think that you should know stuff about econ and you should learn more about the econ world, but it is entirely possible that you can navigate around without looking like you were just saying complete BS, right? Obviously, this requires some degree of weighing, requires a lot of weighing, especially if you are advocating for a, I guess, fluffier or humanitarian goal in comparison to other people who are advocating for more economic goals in terms of resource allocation. But I think it is possible, and I think you should not be so downcast just because the motion is about development or econ or something like that. Next. Okay, I think we're at the last two parts. So let's talk about opening and closing strategies. Next. Okay, let's start with opening. The goal in opening is to limit room for extension. And this is important because obviously closing will try to, and a very common strategy in closing, with the exception of maybe some circuits that hate vertical extensions, is just to try to add additional mechanisms or explain your argument better and then get credited for explaining the argument better. And therefore, I think this is really connected to what I was saying at the start of this lecture, which was it might be better off for you to pick 2, 3, 4, 5 things to run and then run it very, very well, so that those 2 to 5 things can no longer be taken by closing, and you would force them to exert more effort in terms of trying to prove their case to not just be true, but also relevant. In terms of prep, approaching it from opening, you may use a shopping list of potential arguments. Personally, I'm not in favor of that. especially if you're OG, but if you're OO, maybe possible. But more importantly, you may use several frameworks to approaching a debate. So this looks like multiple routes to a problem, meaning if there's a specific problem that clearly is trying to be solved by the motion, maybe there are different ways the problem manifests. So for example, let's say the problem is students don't feel inspired by school anymore, and therefore they don't complete school. Maybe the root to a problem is, number one, they feel like the education curriculum isn't fit for them. Number two, they aren't given enough of a reward structure to feel motivated to finish school. Number three, they feel like other pursuits are more worthy of their time. And then from there, you can attribute to how the motion or your side of the motion either solves that problem, let's say if you're gov, or exacerbates that problem, let's say you're op. Different incentives, different actors, different context. I will skip this in the interest of time. But argumentation is not the end all be all of opening strategy. I will cover this a little bit later when I talk about strategy from the lens of the world's judging manual. But for now, let's talk about closing. Since I know a lot of people were asking about that a while ago. So obviously the job is to create room for extension. Therefore, strategy-oriented prep is more than argument-oriented prep. There are two types of extensions, vertical and horizontal, where vertical explores similar themes, and horizontal explores new frames and etc. In the moment, you might have material taken away from you. Consider if it is worth keeping and if it is salvageable. And what I mean by that is that, let's say, the argument is, the motion is, this house supports girl boss feminism. And then opening government argues already about how girl boss feminism is good because we want to encourage, it encourages women to be more active participants in the corporate structure, in the workplace, ganon. And you were planning to run something similar. You probably want to assess, like maybe look into specific mechanisms of how you prove this, specific characterizations of how you prove this, and assess how much of an overlap has been made by opening government. I would suggest if the overlap is very big, chuck it, defend something else. And that's where speed and pickup is very important. But an important thing I want to note on this is that on closing, you might be tempted to just make as many arguments as possible. But again, I think to just make a shopping list of arguments doesn't take into account how you want to frame and defend the argument. Because creating an argument that's clearly new from opening is like half the battle. The other half of the battle is to be able to convince the judge that it is something that is important. So what I did personally with Riva while we were preparing for WDC is that whenever we were closing, we would prepare scenario 1 and scenario 2, where scenario 1 assumes that our opening runs this specific kind of argument, and scenario 2 scenario 1 assumes if opening runs this kind of argument, we run this kind of argument, and then we've outlined the basic header of every argument we will run under that specific scenario. And then the flip is on scenario 2, meaning if they run this and then we run this, and then based on, let's say, PM-LO exchange, we just decide later on what to run instead. I don't know if there's a video of this online, but an example of this is the LIV 2023 quarter. I think it was the quarter or the semi, one of those two, where we specifically did the strategy of we outlined on a paper scenario 1 versus scenario 2. And then chose the extension based on how PM-LO went. Okay, next please. Switching positions. This is about demonstrating why closing is important. Next, please. There are two ways to weigh the extension. And I think you want to view it through different kinds of debates. One is common goal debates, and two is different goal debates. Next, please. Common goal debates. This is a non-exhaustive list, but there are different ways to weigh it. I think one is on likelihood. Are you able to prove that the outcome is true and that it will happen? Number two is scope of impact. So if you are sharing a similar goal, like increasing employment, hedging financial risk for financial institutions, or increasing female empowerment, how much do you benefit? Do you benefit more segments of a specific kind of vulnerable actor, or do you benefit more kinds of countries, or do you increase more benefits? You know, there are different ways to go about that, but that's the general idea behind scope of impact. Burden of proof is, are you able to meet the specific threshold or the burden set by the motion? And the third is there potential risk assuming failure? So meaning, if you don't succeed, is it irreversible? How bad are the outcomes? If they're not as bad, then that's good for you. And conversely, if you're trying to impose that burden on the other side, then you want to explain why, how bad is the fallout should it happen. Next, please. Different goal debates. So in instances where the goal is different, you want to look at likelihood or prerequisites. So if let's say you prove goal 1 and opposing side is proving goal 2, then you want to say that maybe this is a prerequisite to that. Or maybe if you're closing and you're trying to weigh against opening, you want to say that this is prerequisite to the claim that comes from opening because reason 1, 2, 3. It's not enough for you to say that it is a prerequisite. You kind of have to explain why it is a prerequisite, because it's not intuitive to the judge. Number 2, vulnerability. Maybe you are advocating for a different goal in the sense that we're advocating for a different kind of actor. You might want to explain why they're more vulnerable. Third is scope of impact. You already know that. Fourth is extent of change. This is somewhat similar to scope of impact. Fifth and sixth are both about the stakeholders, their principal obligation, and their morals. So sometimes in instances where the goal is different, you might have a way to principally justify it, or you might want to say, especially if it's an actor motion, is it aligned with their morals, for example? In terms of nuance, if it's like a policy motion, for example, you might want to find a way that there's a specific nuance to a specific kind of stakeholder. So, for example, a discussion on feminism in the broadest sense or in pop culture and media might be a different discussion from feminism in the developing world, because obviously we're talking about different kinds of feminists, different kinds of oppressed minorities, etc. Next, please. This was already covered. Next, please. Okay, taking a look at the WDC manual, there are 3 parts I want to talk about. Let's go to 2.2. So in terms of persuasiveness, this is simply just based on the WDC manual. If you want to go through it, you can go through it. It's section 2.2. It's called What is Persuasiveness? And it talks about what are things that could make a claim persuasive to a judge. And this is essentially it. It really just means prove it. You can prove it structurally through giving reasons for why something is true or false, or you can give examples to demonstrate why it is true or false, or intuition pump that these are practices or benefits or harms that we have already seen reflect in a real example as seen in widely shared moral institutions in favor of an argument. Next, please. 2.3 is on rebuttal, engagement, and comparisons. And what I want to highlight here is that arguments, in terms of a judge, when they are credited when they are not wildly implausible or contradictory or not successfully rebutted. So, for example, if someone makes an argument that under the motion, this house would ban guns, and their argument on Gov was ban guns because gun ownership is reckless, it's killed many people. Obviously, that's very plausible to me because, you know, in the real world, people actually get killed by illegal gun ownership and even legal gun ownership. So that's pretty plausible to me. But if someone comes up and says, this house would ban guns, and their argument is it's because the use of guns takes away from their academics, obviously I'll be like a little skeptical of that, because obviously that's just an argument in favor of people doing activities that are not related to schoolwork, and especially since judges are expected to have like bare minimum logical and critical thinking skills in terms of assessing an argument. Therefore, when an argument is clearly implausible, I do think it is better off to respond to stronger material, and this is specifically what you are instructed to do in the WDC judging manual. But the more important note, I think, that is really applicable to real world debate and the way that judges think, because I don't really think that the judges think in the same way the manual does. It's not like they upload the manual to their brain. But it's more of persuasion is also based on engagement with other teams. So you are what you don't respond to, you are as strong as to what you are able to respond to. And therefore, it is not enough for you to argue in general. You also have to be able to respond to the claims from other teams, or be able to revolve the case in order for it to fit more closely to what the team is able to prove or not to prove, for example. Next slide. Finally, on crediting, what determines the burdens? The burden may be implied on the motion itself, and the burden may be proven by specific teams. So obviously, for the motion itself, a motion that says this House should prioritize the vaccination of law-abiding citizens in the case of major epidemics, it's specific cases versus generality. So you should not, as a judge, any argument from that motion that tries to suggest that in all cases we shouldn't prioritize law-abiding citizens, or we should or should not prioritize law-abiding citizens, does not seem plausible to me, because the motion is specifically asking me to assess this in the context of a major epidemic. So the framing and the argument has to be within that specific context. Similarly, in example number 2, with this House believes that assassination is a legitimate tool for foreign policy, if opposition may argue that you should not believe this because assassination is illegal, it is not automatically plausible to me, because you have to explain to me why illegalness is tantamount to illegitimacy. Because again, the standard imposed by the argument or by the motion is that it is a legitimate tool for foreign policy. So you have to debate it on the basis of that specific metric, which is whether or not it is legitimate for foreign policy. And part of that debate is, if you choose to argue it is illegal, you have to also argue why illegality is tantamount to illegitimacy. Next slide, please. I think this is the last part. So as a final note, I think I want to demonstrate what I just said through this specific motion. This House believes that social media has done more harm than good for political discourse. I do think the first thing you want to highlight, next slide, please, is that there is a nuance to the part of more harm than good. It demands that it is not enough for you to demonstrate that there is a harm, but to weigh that harm against the good. So analyze, for example, if the addition of more trolls, more misinformation is significantly better than the amount of people that have been able to share their lived experiences with their own respective political landscape. Which one is more important than the other? Which one is more mitigatable? Those are discussions and levels of weighing that you should be having in a motion that discusses more harm than good, in comparison to just being able to give more harms in comparison to the amount of good that the opposing side is able to give. And in similar vein, in line with what I just discussed, next slide, please. There's also a part of the motion that includes for political discourse. So in terms of explaining social media, it's not enough for you to say that social media is bad or good for XYZ reason on social media. It has to be in the context of political discourse. So it could be in the context of misinformation. It could be in the context of elections. It could be in the context, for example, of advocacy groups and how they advocate and lobby for their own causes. It could be about political censorship, whatever. But it has to be a weighing between harm versus good through the lens of the interest of political discourse. And therefore, the likely discussions that we're going to have is probably one on what exactly are the aims of political discourse, or what was political discourse before social media was rampant and ubiquitous thing. Okay, next please. Okay, we've arrived at the end. I just want to give I just want to give credit where credit is due. This lecture was made based on the following: personal experience, past slide, weighing, and the weighing slide also, by the way, is based on, I think, a previous lecture that Riva gave on strategy and weighing. Also, a strategy and prep lecture that I gave for HKPDS 2023. Miko Vitug's lectures on strategy and prep, they are on YouTube. Manchester Debating Union's lectures on strategy and prep, also from YouTube. And obviously, the WDC Speaking and Judging Manual. Okay, that's the end. I know I am significantly over time, but yes, we have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Bea. Same thing. So if you have questions, you can raise your hand, or you can also just PM me, but you can also PM Bea directly.
Hello. So the question that was first given is, hi Bea, do you suggest teams do self-prep? So like in BP, probably a minute or two, but in AP, in our case, 5 minutes. Alternatively, are there other strategies we can take in terms of just composing ourselves so we are not all over the place mid-prep and debate? Okay. Yes, I do advise self-prep. I mean, when I was in third year, I was a self-prep type of person. Around fourth year, not as much. I think it's a case to case basis, especially because sometimes motions get a little confusing. Like, what was the name of that motion in Worlds? The freaking centrist compact debate. Sometimes there are motions where it will really take a while for you to digest what it's actually asking you to defend. And so, yes, sometimes self prep is important. My personal preference is 1 minute for both BP and AP. I personally would not take I would not take like up to 5 minutes for AP, but it really might just depend on what you and your partner need. And that's up for you guys to discuss. So again, it goes back to honesty. In terms of not being all over the place, I think for BP, it's really about getting into the synergy of it. I think what I did sometimes was that, especially since I'm a chronic first speaker, I would always be like, hello, I want to run this and this. This will be my first argument. This will be my second argument. And then let's work on the first argument first. So let's create the skeleton for the first argument. Then we create the skeleton for the second argument. And then we think about other things that other teams might run. That's just my personal preference because I want to come into the room with the confidence that I have a skeleton for my whole speech already because I'm quite confident more or less in my ability to be able to build arguments in general. And then maybe sometimes if the motion is spec in a way that I don't understand it and my partner knows something about it, so I'll ask them questions about it. So yeah, I think that's one way. For AP, what I did in UADC with Riva and Riv was that we would spend maybe the first 10 minutes trying to build my speech such that it's really laid down. The stance is clear, the framing is clear, every argument is clear. And then after that, I would like do quiet time. So I would be on Discord and then I would mute. And then I would build on my own so that I can build it in my own words while at the same time they're building and preparing to call this they're preparing their deputy and whip speeches respectively so that they can focus on their own and then we communicate how those three tie in together coming into the round. So I think that's one way to look at it. I hope that answers your question, and in the rest of time I will just go straight to the next question. If the opponent's strategy is to gaslight the judge with biased information, should we highlight that they made up stuff in our own speeches? Yes, but I do think that you can only successfully do that if you actually give the actual facts. Like if they lie and say, it's a bad example. Never mind. All I can think about are medyo controversial examples. But if you know the real facts, you should probably say the real facts. I do think though that like fighting on what the facts are is a little bit of a waste of time. I think you're better off just kind of going like, okay, independent of the facts, this is about, we gave to you the analysis, the structural reasons, mga ganon. It's also important when, especially if it's like IR, for example, and people are lying. I think you kind of have to realize that part of an IR debate is explaining why people are likely to do things. So leveraging those examples and the real matter that you know for a fact to create incentives for why a certain geopolitical actor is going to act a certain way or behave a certain way, and what they're likely to get out of it, et cetera, I think would give you a leg up and liberate you from that lock of trying to just fight it out over the facts. Next question. As the partner of a newbie debater or someone that is not yet skilled in debating, how do you like to help them in prep while making sure he improves? Ah. I think kasi, it's a little, especially if you're trying to like bring out a case, it's a little hard because I have done pro-amps before. And well, to be fair, that's because it's like sometimes you want to win, and I understand that naman. So I think going back to what I said a while ago, doing stuff outside of prep is just as important as what you do inside of prep. So things like case building with them or at least processing the round with them before or after rounds, I think is important also, because you can't really expect a newbie to automatically understand everything within 15 minutes. I think that's a lot of pressure on them. But if you're outside of the round na and you have almost all the time you can, I think that's a room where you have more flexibility for being able to discuss things with them. They might be free to might feel more free to ask questions because they're not pressured by time or pressured by having to have a speech na on their paper by the end of 15 minutes. So again, I think it's really, you have to be extra patient with them. Do you have any structured format of your speech? No, I don't have a structured format. The most structure I have is like introduction, maybe a response, because most of the time I integrate my responses, and then argument one, argument two. But in terms of structure, it's really like sometimes I will prove, let's say argument one. What's an example? So yeah, for example, argument ito. In world's partial double octos. So we were closing opposition and we were against lifting all restrictions on India's mandis, which is like their agricultural markets. And then I wanted to explain that this is going to be very bad for farmers. And then I said this could be very bad for farmers. Number one, we have to prove that once you lift restrictions, there is going to be massive concentration in richer areas because farmers want to make the most money. And then I prove reason one, reason two, reason three. As a result of this concentration, this comes at the expense of other markets that are poorer. Reason one, reason two, reason three. This is bad because these markets, these in poorer rural areas, are more vulnerable. Reason one, reason two, reason three. So normally, ako kasi, I have an idea na of what I think are the burdens of proof that I need to meet in order to make sure an argument gets through. And from there, I just build reasons under those burdens of proof. Do you think that it's okay to just stick with the info slide given just to justify your slide and go in the spirit of the motion, or is it much better? Well, ideally, what is given in an info slide is what is true. So even if you are matter loaded on the motion, you are aware. An info slide does not exist to give you everything you need to know about the motion in order to win. It mostly just exists to give you context and definition. But for the actual stuff that would make you win a round, it is not in the info slide. Well, not always in the info slide. It's mostly in matter and what you read outside of the round. There are times where you can like really extrapolate arguments from an info slide, but that's really like Hail Mary. That's really like that's last resort gaming right there. So I would advise that you just read and debate more. Hi, you have mentioned earlier how it's a need to really know what's going on in the world to like not panic. What social media publication? Ayun! Game. I really like podcasts. I am such a podcast advocate. I like Financial Times. Yung mga super mabilis lang, like Financial Times, they have an AM and PM. They release every AM and PM in American time. It's really, really short lang. It's very quick. I also like The Economist, but they've been making it paid recently, which is quite sad. I Foreign Affairs, yes. So mostly those three. And then I subscribe to I subscribe to Morning Brew, the typical ones naman. Morning Brew, mga ganun for mga business related stuff. And then I think there was a time I subscribed to the Japan Times for Tokyo IV because I was scared that a Japan motion would come out. Yan. I can give a list. I can give a list. I can give I'm sure naman, sorry, Riva, you're going to share the slides naman later, right?
Yep, yep.
Okay, so I can just put the extended answer in the slide and then so you'll see it naman.
Sure,
Anyway. Okay. Ay, hello, Ashley. Anyway, any tips on how to approach a round with a very strong opponent? How do you think you can you can dissect, outweigh, and outplay this strategy? I think this answer is less about what you can actually do from a technical debate sense. And I think it is more about mindset. Well, at least that's from my experience. Most of what hindered me from actually going against a really good team when I was younger um, was I was really so caught up in the idea that they were so good to the point that they were someone that you really couldn't respond to. And what would normally happen to me is that I'd leave the round, I'd think about the motion again, and I'd think about the round, and I'd realize how easy it is to respond to them and how like sorry for the word, but like how dumb their argument was. And really all that was holding me back was that I was so caught up in how good they are and everything they've ever achieved. I think what you want to do is kind of leave all preconceptions at the door and really just debate. Like no one I understand that like clout and bias is still a problem in debate, but you know, reasonably no judge is going to make someone win solely based on their achievements, solely based on how they speak, and solely based on where they come from. So I think a lot of people that feel disadvantaged in rounds often, unfortunately, allow that disadvantage to come in the way of them being able to be locked in, of them being able to deeply listen into the round and be able to critically think about other people's speeches. And once you leave those preconceptions at the door, I think it becomes a lot more easier to really dissect, outweigh, and outplay their strategy. For a first speaker, is it beneficial to hinge more on principal arguments, or should we also prioritize pragmatics or mechanization during the speech? The prep style of my partner and I is basically they prioritize the pragmatics while I go on principle as first speaker, especially on opening. So I don't think kasi it's in all cases you should prioritize principle or pragmatic. I personally think that it kind of depends on the debate. Like obviously, if you're going to go, let's say, into an economics argument, and you can already feel like people are going to argue about how this impacts, let's say, certain kinds of actors in the economy, like consumers, sellers, producers, suppliers, etc., people in rural, urban areas. I don't think, for example, it wouldn't be so wise to run an exclusively principled argument. Because you'll just get eaten up by all the people that will be like, if you can't feed them, then the principle is for nothing. So it's really a case by case basis. And I personally prefer pragmatic arguments more, but that's just a personal preference. I think the real answer is that it's just a case by case basis. So it's going back to understanding what the burdens of the motion are. Last two questions, I guess, because it's almost 9. Hello, Ate Bea. If you have a strong closing bench and you can't think of a lot of arguments to try to stop your closing from extending, should you try to aim for second by expanding the argument instead as if it is a vertical extension? Or is there a tip on this? First thing, if I were opening, I would not try to hedge for second. Like hedging for second sounds like a very closing thing once you get the idea that opening is just taking everything. On opening, I think it's really like the simple way to put it is just prove the 2 to 5 things and then provide 3 to 4 to 5 mechanisms on why, or levels of weighing on why it is the most important thing of the debate. I think even if they are able to extend on something, they have to exert a lot more effort in trying to outweigh. So I wouldn't really call it hedging for second, because I feel like hedging for second is already putting yourself into the mentality because you're basing your assumption of how the round is going to go based on a speech that hasn't been said yet. So again, going back to my answer to Ashley, it's like you're basing it on a preconceived notion of how someone's going to perform just because of things like rep or past performance or the idea that they're strong. And obviously, we should give opponents respect and credit where credit is due. But I don't think it should go so far as to let us feel like we have to cop a second just because they're so strong. Especially since they're in closing and you haven't even heard them speak yet. I think it's argue like normal. Argue like normal. Last, okay, so I was recently paired with my significant other in an upcoming debate tournament who had just picked up debating last November. Question is, how can we be able to at least guide her to be better in prep time, because this is the first time we paired together and I'm anxious that it will affect both of our performances. Well, you can, case build more, prepare more. I mean, I don't know if that's how you want to spend your date time with them, but okay. Different strokes for different folks. I think especially if they're very new to debate, patience is very important. Um, helping them out in terms of uh in terms of the prep, for example, case builds, getting them more accustomed into the groove and the speed of thought in terms of debate would really help. But again, above all, be patient. Because they just picked up debating. And we really need to understand people's limits. Is that okay, Nariva?
What an excellent question to end our day with. So, before we go, so everyone, sorry, give a heart react to Bea. Thank you, Bea. Great lecture. Okay, so we'll take a picture. Don't worry. But before that, we have a feedback form. I just want to emphasize why this is important. This is the first time we're doing this, so you guys can basically call yourselves the pilot test. That's why there are very few of you, because we didn't want to, make a lot of people. We don't want to ask a lot of people to join, especially if we didn't really know what to do yet. And so feedback for every session is very important, because we want to make sure that, for example, for the session next Friday, that if there is a problem with the way that we're running things, we want to solve it as much as possible. We want to make improvements along the way. So that's why it's really important for us that you guys fill up the feedback form per session, and the form allows you to do that. So don't worry about that. And it really helps us try to make this program better for everyone. So I hope you take just a quick 2 minutes, maybe even a minute if you're that fast, to just fill up the feedback form. We'd really appreciate it. Okay, so picture time. So everyone turn on your cameras. Go on. Morty, come here.
Hi, so I'm just saying this since I'm also VP for OPR. This picture will be posted on our the story of FB and IG. If you don't consent to that, don't turn on your camera. But if you do consent to your picture being taken, feel free to turn it on right now. Tapos biglang wala nag-turn on, no? Well,
Come on,
okay.
guys.
It's
Don't you
really
want the
your
picture?
response.
Don't you
Really
want the picture with Ate Bea? Don't you want to be featured on the ADS page?
my Asian champion.
Okay, so sorry, I'm not gonna say who, but someone said they're not gonna turn on the camera because they're on the way to the airport, which is understandable. But for those who are not on the way to the airport, please turn. If you are comfortable, turn on your cameras. Okay, it's just the three of us. Or
Okay. Well,
Clarice, turn on your camera.
What? Guys, come on, guys. Turn on your camera. If we
This
just take
is-
a photo of just us, it's literally just gonna be an ADS pub picture. It's not gonna be a debit picture.
Guys,
I
think
mean,
about
I guess when we
this.
turn it on, I guess just have it in note that next time we'll likely ask you to turn it on na lang. So if now you
Ay,
feel, oh my God, di ako
it's
napaganda.
broken. The
Yeah.
collective action problem is
Collective
broken.
action is problem is broken.
Okay,
They're collectivizing.
okay. I'm gonna count 5 seconds for anyone who wants to join. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's go. Let's take a picture. Okay. Oh, sorry, Clarice will take a picture. So, Clarice, can you count down?
Oh, yeah, okay. 3, 2, 1, smile. Last one. 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay.
Ayun. Okay. Slay. If you guys will likely take another picture next time. So kung gusto niyo magpaganda next time, tas makeup kayo, kayo, suklay, that's your choice. Pero thank you for coming to the session.
All right, so sorry, it's exactly 9. So technically we are on schedule despite logistical problems at the start. Thank you all for attending our first session. Again, if you had any problems with this session, please just tell us. We will try to improve it in the next coming sessions so we can all benefit from this as much as we can. So thank you. And then I hope to see you guys on Friday.
Thank you, guys.
Bye guys. Ingat-ingat.